Welcome, weary travelers of the night, to another episode from At Hollow Midnight, where the mundane transforms into the strangely compelling, and the ordinary becomes the stuff of legend. If you find yourself frequently staring at the ceiling, wondering about the forgotten corners of history or the quiet absurdities of human existence, then perhaps this is the channel for you. Do consider subscribing, joining our small, sleepy congregation, and together we can explore tales that might not lull you to immediate slumber, but will certainly distract your restless mind with the peculiar. Tonight we unfurl the first scroll of a truly singular story, one that unravels the peculiar fate of a man whose very breath shook the foundations of faith. Chapter 1. The Humble Beginnings of Brother Balthazar. The Abbey of St. Alcuin lay nestled in a forgotten crease of the world, a valley so shrouded in mist and ancient trees that it seemed to exist perpetually on the cusp of dawn or dusk. Its stones, weathered by centuries of unblinking sky, hummed with a profound and almost tangible quietude. Here, silence was not merely the absence of noise but a living, breathing entity, a sacred companion to the monks who dedicated their lives to prayer, contemplation, and the laborious transcription of illuminated manuscript. The air itself seemed to filter sound, muffling the distant bleating of sheep or the rustle of autumn leaves into a gentle whisper, a mere suggestion of the world beyond the abbey walls. Life within these hallowed confines moved with the deliberate, measured cadence of dripping water, each hour marked by the sonorous toll of bells, and the soft shuffle of sandaled feet across cold flagstones. This was a place where the smallest disturbance felt like a clap of thunder, and even a whispered prayer could echo like a declaration. It was into this bastion of profound stillness that Brother Balthazar arrived, a man whose piety was as evident as his unfortunate and utterly unprecedented nocturnal talent. Brother Balthazar was, to all outward appearances, a monk of exemplary character. He was of middling height and somewhat plump, with cheeks that perpetually seemed to blush with earnestness and eyes that held a gentle, unwavering gaze. He arrived at St. Alcuin's as a postulant, keen to shed the noisy distractions of the secular world and embrace the contemplative life. From the moment he donned his simple wool habit, he embodied the very virtues the Benedictine rule espoused. He was diligent in his matins, his voice a soft, steady baritone during lauds, prime, terce, sext, nuns, vespers, and compline. He tilled the monastery gardens with a quiet focus, his hands calloused but careful, nurturing the herbs and vegetables as if each sprout were a nascent prayer. During the communal meals in the refectory, he ate sparingly, his chewing almost imperceptible, his gaze fixed on the sacred texts being read aloud by the lector. He confessed his minor transgressions with genuine humility, and his spiritual adviser, Father Abbott Ignatius, often remarked upon Balthazar's refreshing lack of worldly attachments and his seemingly boundless capacity for serene devotion. He was, in short, the very picture of a model monk, a gentle soul devoted entirely to God and the quietude of monastic life. The early weeks of his residency passed in harmonious, if somewhat bland, tranquility. The dormitory, a long, Spartan hall lined with simple wooden cots, was usually a chamber of deep rhythmic breathing, a collective sigh of devout exhaustion after a day filled with labor and prayer. The subtle creak of ancient beams, the occasional shifting of a brother in his sleep, the distant hoot of an owl, these were the only sounds that dared disturb the sanctity of the monastic night. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a new sound began to insinuate itself into the profound stillness. It began as a faint, almost melodic rumble, a low thrum that some attributed to the monastery's venerable foundations settling further into the earth, or perhaps the wind playing a strange tune on a loose slate tile. Brother Anselm, who slept 2 cots down from Balthazar, initially thought it was the rumblings of his own stomach, a complaint from the previous day's cabbage soup. He would shift, groan, and attempt to ignore it, pulling his coarse blanket higher over his ears. But the sound, unlike a disgruntled digestive system or an old monastery, did not subside. Instead, it grew. From a faint rumble, it swelled into a robust, resonant grumble, then deepened into a guttural roar. It was a sound that defied categorization, yet relentlessly evoked powerful, unsettling imagery. It was the sound of a distant, disgruntled badger, trapped within a stone well, amplified tenfold. It was the slow, deliberate grinding of two ancient millstones, endlessly turning, pulverizing sleep into fine, irritating dust. It was the low, mournful groaning of a ship caught in a storm, its timbers protesting against an unseen force. A sound that made the very air vibrate, and it emanated with an unwavering and unholy consistency from Brother Balthazar. The irony was as profound as it was cruel. Brother Balthazar, the source of this escalating nocturnal cacophony, slept through it all. He slept with the unshakable serenity of a saint in deep communion, his face often adorned with a beatific, almost cherubic smile. He would wake each morning at the first toll of the bells for matins, refreshed and radiating an almost unnerving sense of peaceful contentment, completely oblivious to the ragged, bleary-eyed state of his brethren. He would often comment, with genuine innocence, on how wonderfully well he slept, how peaceful the monastery felt, how the quietude was truly a blessing from God. His sincerity was undeniable, and it only added to the brewing resentment and despair among the other monks. The Abbey of St. Alcuin, once a sanctuary of silence, was slowly but surely being transformed into a nightly theater of sonic terror. The monks, who had once glided through their days with quiet dignity, now stumbled. Brother Thomas, famed for his preternaturally serene sleep, now routinely sat bolt upright at 2 a.m., his heart pounding, convinced the apocalypse had finally arrived, heralded not by trumpets but by a deep, resonant rumble from the bed beside him. Brother Gregory, the monastery's meticulous chronicler, found his quill shaking with exhaustion, his delicate illumination work suffering from blurry eyes and a persistent headache that felt like a persistent drumbeat behind his temples. The beautifully intricate spirals of the initial letters in his manuscripts began to resemble drunken squiggles, and he once, in the sleep-deprived days, transcribed amen as ahem, much to the quiet consternation of the abbot. The sacred silence of the refectory, once filled with the gentle rustle of pages and the soft clink of spoons, now often dissolved into strained, uncomfortable quiet, punctuated only by suppressed yawns and the nervous clearing of throats. The monks, normally paragons of patience and spiritual fortitude, found themselves surprisingly irritable. Minor infractions, once met with a gentle, understanding glance, now elicited sharp rebukes. A spilled bowl of porridge, a misplaced prayer book, even an overly enthusiastic sneeze could trigger a disproportionate burst of frustration. The monks began to consume copious amounts of calming herbal teas, infusions of chamomile and valerian root, but these provided little respite from the nightly assault. Their prayers became less focused, their meditations fragmented by the lingering echoes of the previous night's sonic onslaught. They walked like somnambulists through their daily rituals, their cowls pulled low, their faces pale and drawn. Whispers, hushed and fearful, began to circulate in the cloister during the brief moments of permitted conversation. No one dared to openly accuse Brother Balthazar. How could such an unholy sound issue from a man who seemed so utterly pious during his waking hours? Was it a demonic presence testing their faith? A collective spiritual malady, a punishment for some unknown sin. The idea that the monstrous noise originated from one of their own, from the seemingly blameless Brother Balthazar, was simply unthinkable, an affront to the very order and sanctity of their lives. Even Father Abbott Ignatius, a man whose spiritual fortitude was legendary, began to show subtle signs of strain. A persistent twitch developed in his left eye, and a rare irritability would sometimes surface during morning prayers. A sharp word offered where once there was only calm guidance. He heard the sound, of course, a deep, pervasive hum that seemed to penetrate the very stones of the abbey, yet he could not pinpoint its source with certainty, nor could he reconcile it with the gentle, devout character of any of his monks. He attributed it, publicly, to a testing of their collective spiritual resolve, a sign that the forces of darkness sought to disturb their divine communion. Privately, he spent many a sleepless night in his cell, listening to the resonant thrum that seemed to shake the very foundations of his faith, wondering when or if the blessed silence would ever return to the Abbey of St. Alcon. Brother Balthazar, meanwhile, continued to snore, and with each breath, the monastery, unknowingly to him, edged closer to the brink of chaos. Chapter 2. The night the candles shook, the pervasive hum emanating from Brother Balthazar had long ceased to be a mere annoyance. It had evolved into a foundational tremor, a constant, low-frequency presence that permeated the very stone and timber of the Abbey of St. Alcon. It was no longer confined to the dormitory, nor was it a sound one could simply dismiss as the natural creaking of an ancient edifice. No, this was something altogether more deliberate, more monstrous, like the slow grinding turnings of some colossal, subterranean mechanism. It pressed in on the monks from all sides, a pressure in their ears, a dull ache behind their eyes. During the day, it was a phantom thrum beneath their feet as they walked the cloister, or a subtle vibration in the quill as they copied texts, making the ink smear faintly on occasion, a barely perceptible tremor that mimicked the onset of a fever. But it was in the deepest hours of the night, when the moon hung like a forgotten coin in the velvet sky, and the world outside dissolved into a vast, silent expanse, that Balthazar's exhalations truly reigned supreme. The dormitory, once a haven of tranquil repose, had become a chamber of subtle, unnerving animation. Cups left on bedside tables would shiver almost imperceptibly, their porcelain singing a low, barely audible lament against the wood. Loose floorboards, which had previously creaked only underfoot, now offered up their own hesitant, groaning protests to the unseen force. Brother Bartholomew, known for his meticulous arrangements, would find his neatly folded habit slightly askew upon awakening, as if a mischievous imp had tugged at the fabric in the dead of night. Brother Cuthbert, whose particular affliction was a deeply rooted fear of ghosts, would spend the hours between midnight and matins, convinced that the very walls were breathing, expanding and contracting with a malevolent unseen lung. He would clutch his wooden crucifix so tightly that the carved edges left painful indentations in his palm, his eyes wide and bloodshot in the impenetrable darkness. Sleep, for many, had become a fleeting, treacherous illusion, a series of brief, shallow descents into a twilight state, only to be yanked back to full, groggy awareness by a particularly emphatic guttural snort or a resonant, chest-rattling wheeze. The breaking point, or perhaps more accurately, the moment the monastic community could no longer deny the increasingly physical manifestation of their torment, arrived on a particularly cold and still night during the celebration of Compline. This was the final liturgy of the day, a time of profound quiet and introspection, when the monks gathered in the dimly lit abbey church for a last communal prayer before retiring to the dormitory. The great stone edifice of the church, with its soaring arches and hushed aisles, was usually a sanctuary of ultimate tranquility. The only light came from the scattered beeswax candles, their flames burning with unwavering stillness, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and swayed like ancient spirits. On the altar before the sacred texts stood several tall, thick candles, their wicks trimmed to perfection, their glow illuminating the solemn faces of the chanting monks. Father Abbott Ignatius led the Compline service with his usual grave dignity, his voice a steady drone as he recited the psalms. The air was thick with the scent of old wax and sanctity. The monks, their exhaustion a palpable cloak around them, knelt on their hard wooden prie-dieu, their eyes downcast, attempting to find solace in the ancient words. Brother Balthazar was present, as always, his head bowed in what appeared to be profound devotion, his breathing soft and even, completely unlike the nocturnal thunder that emanated from him once he lay horizontally. All was still, save for the rhythmic rise and fall of the chanting and the gentle rustle of habits as a monk occasionally shifted his weight. Then it began. It was not a sudden burst, but a creeping, insidious presence, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to originate from the very foundations beneath their feet. It started subtly, a barely perceptible vibration through the stone floor, a tremor that ran up the legs of the kneeling monks, causing a few to subtly glance around, their brows furrowed in quiet confusion. The sound deepened, growing in intensity, filling the cavernous space of the church with a deep, pulsing hum. It was the familiar, inescapable resonance of Brother Balthazar's deepest slumber, amplified by the vast resonant chambers of the Abbey church, transformed into something almost sentient, an oppressive force. The first noticeable physical effect was on the candles. The smaller ones, held in the hands of some of the monks, began to flicker erratically, their flames dancing with an unnatural vigor as if caught in an unseen draught, though the air was perfectly still. Then the larger candles on the altar, the ones that had burned with such stoic constancy for centuries, began to oscillate. Slowly at first, their golden flames swayed from side to side, creating elongated, wavering shadows that stretched across the frescoed walls, like tormented phantoms. The movement became more pronounced, a rhythmic, almost violent tremor, causing droplets of molten beeswax to splatter onto the altar cloth, leaving ugly, irregular stains. The monks ceased their chanting, their voices trailing off into an uncertain silence, replaced by the low guttural roar that now filled the church. A collective gasp, hushed but audible, rippled through the congregation. Eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief, darted from the wildly dancing candle flames to Father Abbott Ignatius, whose face, usually a mask of serene composure, was now etched with a profound bewilderment. His left eye, which had begun to twitch only recently, now pulsed almost visibly. The abbot stared at the altar, then at the trembling candles, then back at the horrified faces of his monks. He could feel the vibration himself, a deep hum beneath his feet, a resonant bass note that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Brother Gregory, the chronicler, whose sleep-deprived state had already pushed him to the brink of nervous exhaustion, let out a small, involuntary whimper. He clutched the prie-dieu before him, his knuckles white, convinced that the very ground beneath them was giving way. Brother Anselm, who had initially blamed his own stomach, now felt a distinct vibration in his teeth, a strange, persistent chattering that was entirely beyond his control. He stared at Brother Balthazar, who remained kneeling, head bowed, apparently in a state of profound, peaceful prayer, entirely oblivious to the seismic activity his resting form was generating. Balthazar's piety, once a source of comfort, now seemed an almost diabolical ruse, a cloak for an unholy power. The chalice and paten, usually reposing in dignified stillness upon the altar, now rattled faintly, producing a delicate, metallic clinking that was strangely audible above the pervasive rumble. A small, intricately carved wooden crucifix, placed on a side table near the sacristy, toppled over with a soft hollow thud, its polished surface briefly reflecting the erratic dancing light of the candles before settling into darkness. It was a subtle, almost gentle desecration, yet it struck a primal fear into the hearts of the monks. This was no longer just about disturbed sleep. This was a physical manifestation, a disruption of the sacred space itself, a mockery of their most solemn rite. Father Abbott Ignatius, with a force of will that belied his inner turmoil, managed to regain his composure. He cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound in the vibrating air. "Brothers," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, though it trembled slightly on the edges, "let us not be swayed by these unusual occurrences. We must remain steadfast in our faith. It is merely a test." His gaze swept across the faces of his monks, seeking reassurance in their expressions, but finding only pale, drawn countenances, their eyes wide with unspoken questions. He avoided looking directly at Brother Balthazar, though the source of the persistent, earth-shaking rumble was becoming horrifyingly clear to him. The air in the church felt thick and heavy, charged with an invisible resonant energy. The beeswax candles continued their frenetic dance, their flames now dangerously low, threatening to extinguish themselves entirely. With a shared, almost desperate resolve, the monks attempted to resume compline. Their voices, however, were thin and reedy, struggling against the pervasive thrum that made the very air vibrate. The words of the psalms seemed to fragment in the air, lost amidst the unholy rhythm of Brother Balthazar's slumber. Each deep exhalation from the innocent monk on his knees seemed to resonate through the ancient stone, sending shivers through the ground and up the monk's spines. It was as if the abbey itself were a gigantic organ, and Balthazar, in his unwitting sleep, was playing a deep, discordant note that vibrated through every pipe and chamber, shaking its very foundations. The compline service concluded in a state of barely suppressed panic, the monks fleeing the church with an uncharacteristic haste, their minds reeling not from spiritual insight but from the undeniable physical proof of the terror that had taken root in their quiet monastery. As they shuffled back to the dormitory, the air grew colder, and the pervasive vibration seemed to follow them, seeping in the very fabric of their habits, their bones, and their increasingly unraveling sanity. The candles on the altar, left flickering precariously, continued their strange dance, mute witnesses to the night. The quiet monastery of St. Alcuin trembled not from an earthquake, but from the profound, resonant, and utterly innocent snore of Brother Balthazar. Chapter 3. The Abbot's Dilemma. The morning after the unsettling compline, when the very candles of St. Alcuin's had quivered and danced to an unheard, unholy rhythm, dawned gray and heavy. A thick, oppressive mist clung to the valley, mirroring the profound disquiet that had settled over the monastery. The usual quiet murmur of matins was laced with an undeniable tension. Monks shuffled through the corridors with an even greater weariness than before, their faces grim, their eyes hollowed by a terror that had now acquired a distinct physical manifestation. The intangible fear of disturbed sleep had calcified into a very real, very unsettling experience. The church itself, the bedrock of their faith, had vibrated in sympathy with Brother Balthazar's profound slumber. The crucifix had fallen, the molten beeswax had splattered. The memory of it was a bitter taste in their mouths, a persistent echo in their ears that no amount of quiet contemplation could dislodge. Father Abbott Ignatius, normally a man of unwavering spiritual fortitude, felt the weight of the night pressing down upon him like a tombstone. His left eye, a betraying nerve, twitched almost incessantly. He had spent the remaining hours until matins pacing his cell, the deep, resonating thrum from the dormitory below feeling more akin to a demonic hum than the innocent exhalation of a sleeping brother. His inner peace, a carefully cultivated garden of serenity, had been trampled by the invisible, rhythmic footfalls of Balthazar's snores. The question that had previously been a vague, unsettling whisper in his mind now screamed for resolution. What, in the name of all that was holy, was to be done about Brother Balthazar? He convened a special chapter, meeting after morning prayers, an unprecedented gathering of the senior monks. Prior Alaric, a man of rigid adherence to monastic rule, Cellarer Benedict, whose practical mind managed the monastery's provisions and temporal affairs, novice Master Cuthbert, whose patience was usually boundless but now seemed dangerously frayed, and Brother Gregory, the chronicler, whose detailed observations were often more helpful than his nervous disposition suggested. The air in the chapter house, usually filled with the scent of old parchment and beeswax, now carried a faint, almost metallic, tang of unspoken fear. "Brothers," Father Abbot Ignatius began, his voice gravelly, his gaze sweeping across their drawn faces, "we are here to address a matter of pressing spiritual and temporal concern." He paused, choosing his words with deliberate care. "The disturbance we experienced during Compline last night was singular, and it was, I believe, directly linked to the phenomenon that has plagued our dormitory for weeks." He did not name Balthazar directly, but the unspoken name hung heavy in the air, a phantom bell tolling. Prior Alaric, a man whose spine was as straight as a freshly hewn timber, cleared his throat. "Abbot, with all due respect, disturbance is too mild a word. The very fabric of this holy house trembled. The candles, which symbolized the light of Christ, danced as if possessed by a fever. And the crucifix, Abbot, the crucifix fell." His voice, usually precise and devoid of emotion, held a hint of barely suppressed outrage. "This is not merely a phenomenon. This is either a direct affront, a spiritual attack, or a profound failing of one amongst us." He looked pointedly towards the empty space where Balthazar would normally sit. Celera Benedict, a pragmatic man whose concerns rarely strayed beyond the yield of the harvest and the quality of the monastery's brew, chimed in, his brow furrowed. "It affects the brothers, Abbot, thought B. Brother Thomas has taken to sleeping in the chapel, claiming the spirits are less boisterous there. Brother Anselm has developed a nervous tic in his left eye, mirroring your own, Abbot, if you'll permit me to say so. And the transcription work, Brother Gregory's script, has deteriorated considerably. Our meticulous records are becoming, dare I say, almost illegible in places. This affects our sacred duties, our very livelihood." Brother Gregory, usually meek, nodded vigorously, his eyes wide. "The ink trembles on the quill, Abbot! And the visions. I dreamed last night that the entire monastery was a giant set of bellows, and a monstrous invisible blacksmith was pumping it, creating a great, unholy roar. And then the walls began to sigh. A deep, earth-shaking sigh, as if the very stones were in anguish." He shuddered, pulling his cowl tighter around his pale face. Novice Master Cuthbert, a kind and gentle soul, offered a more charitable interpretation. "Perhaps, Abbot, it is a test, a divine trial, sent to us to strengthen our faith. The good Lord tests us in many ways, sometimes through trials of the flesh, sometimes through tribulations of the spirit. Brother Balthazar is, in his waking hours, a monk of exemplary piety, gentle and devoted. Could this not be a unique, albeit challenging, manifestation of some spiritual power within him, a resonance of his fervent prayers, a sound that vibrates with the very intensity of his devotion?" He offered a tentative, hopeful smile, though it faded quickly under the collective, skeptical gazes of the others. Prior Alaric snorted, a sound remarkably similar to a muffled version of Balthazar's nightly rumble. "A spiritual power, novice master, that shakes crucifixes and splatters wax. I have read no accounts of saints whose piety manifested as a seismic event. This sounds less like divine power and more like a demonic influence, or at best a grave physical failing. Is Brother Balthazar indulging in some nightly gluttony that causes such gastric distress? Or perhaps, dare I suggest it, a subtle form of spiritual pride that manifests as this infernal racket?" Father Abbot Ignatius raised a hand, his expression pained. "Brother Alaric, such accusations are grave. Brother Balthazar is utterly devoted. He eats sparingly, he fasts, he confesses. He is completely oblivious to the disturbance he causes. I have observed him closely. He wakes refreshed, genuinely puzzled by the weariness of his brethren. His innocence is beyond doubt." "Then it is an affliction," exclaimed Celera Benedict. A malady of the humors, perhaps a blockage of the phlegm, or an imbalance of the color. We should send for a physician, Abbott, one who understands the complex workings of the bodily winds. Perhaps a purgative is in order, or a bleeding, or a poultice of potent herbs. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, already mentally calculating the cost of such a specialist. Brother Gregory, ever the chronicler of the peculiar, chimed in again. But Abbott, what if it is neither malady nor malice? What if it is a sign, a warning of some great upheaval to come, the earth groaning under the weight of future sin? Or perhaps, conversely, a sign of extraordinary grace, too vast for our mortal ears to comprehend, manifesting as a tremor? His eyes darted nervously, torn between the terrifying possibilities. The abbot sighed, running a weary hand over his face. The twitch in his eyes seemed to have migrated to his cheek. We must consider all possibilities. But we cannot allow this sonic presence to continue unchecked. The brothers are suffering. Our work is suffering. Our very purpose, the cultivation of silence and spiritual communion, is being undermined. It is difficult to meditate when one fears the collapse of the very walls around them. Prior Alaric pressed his point. If it is a physical failing, it must be remedied. If it is a spiritual affliction, it requires exorcism or severe penance. If it is, as novice Master Cuthbert suggests, a peculiar divine resonance, then we must understand its meaning and perhaps seek to harness it. Though I confess I cannot imagine how one might harness such a disruptive force. But inaction, Abbott, is no longer an option. The sanctity of St. Alcuin's is at stake. The debate continued, swirling around Brother Balthazar's unwitting sleep. They discussed the possibility of moving him to a solitary cell, far from the dormitory, but the notion was quickly dismissed. The abbey was old, its walls thick, but the resonance had proven itself capable of penetrating stone. Besides, isolating him might imply punishment for a sin he did not commit, or worse, acknowledge that his presence was, indeed, some unholy contamination. They considered prayer vigils, specific chants, even the placement of sacred relics around his bed, all proposed with varying degrees of desperation and absurdity. Father Abbot Ignatius listened, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting duties. As a shepherd of his flock, he was bound to protect them from harm, even if that harm emanated from one of their own. As a spiritual guide, he had to discern the true nature of this affliction. Was it a natural phenomenon, a medical issue, a test from God, or a whisper from the adversary? And as the head of the monastery, he had to ensure the continued functioning and sanctity of St. Alcuin's. Brother Balthazar is an innocent, the abbot reiterated, almost to himself, as if trying to convince the very walls. His heart is pure. This is not a matter of willful transgression. He looked at the chronicler. Brother Gregory, have you found any mention in the ancient texts, in the chronicles of other monasteries, of such a phenomenon? A monk whose very slumber caused such resonant effects? Brother Gregory shook his head miserably. None, Abbot. I have consulted the great book of miracles and afflictions, the tome of strange omens and portents, even the collected letters of St. Jerome regarding the perils of the flesh. There are accounts of monks levitating, monks speaking in tongues, monks living on air alone. But a monk whose snoring could shake the foundations of a church. This, Abbot, appears to be an unprecedented event in the annals of monastic history. The uniqueness of the problem only deepened the abbot's dilemma. There was no established protocol for a monk who inadvertently transformed his holy dwelling into a nightly seismograph. The monastic rule, so comprehensive in its guidance for every aspect of life, was silent on the matter of earth-shaking somnolence. The lack of precedent was both a curse and a strange, unsettling fascination. It pushed them into uncharted spiritual territory, where the lines between the natural, the supernatural, and the comically absurd blurred. Father Abbot Ignatius finally stood, a decision, however tentative, forming in his mind. We cannot accuse Brother Balthazar of malice, nor can we simply endure this. It is clear that the well-being of the community is being gravely affected. We will proceed thusly. Celera Benedict, you will make discreet inquiries in the nearest town for any physician, or, failing that, a herbalist of considerable renown, who might offer a diagnosis or remedy for conditions of the airway and respiration. Prior Alaric, you will conduct a rigorous spiritual assessment of Brother Balthazar, observing his waking piety, his adherence to rule, but also, and I cannot stress this enough, without prejudice or accusation. Novice Master Cuthbert, you will engage the novices in a sustained period of prayer for discernment, for wisdom, and for peace within these walls. And Brother Gregory, you will continue your research, however fruitless it may seem, into any obscure texts that might shed light on such a unique affliction or divine manifestation. He paused, his gaze fixed on a beam above, as if seeking divine inspiration from the dust motes, dancing in the faint light, filtering through the high window. And until we have clarity, until we have exhausted all avenues of spiritual and temporal remedy, Brother Balthazar will sleep alone. I shall assign him the old scriptorium tower at the furthest reaches of the abbey. Its walls are thickest there, and its isolation might afford the other brothers some semblance of uninterrupted rest. It is not a punishment, but a temporary measure for the greater good of the community. The proposal of isolation, though framed as a practical necessity, carried with it an unspoken acknowledgment of Balthazar's otherness, his peculiar and disruptive nature. The senior monks exchanged weary, almost relieved glances. The abbot had made a decision, a concrete step, however small, against the mounting chaos. Yet, as Father Abbot Ignatius dismissed them, he felt no true peace. He knew that the problem was not merely relocating Balthazar. The problem was Balthazar himself, and the deep, resonant mystery of his nightly song. He retired to his cell, the twitch in his eye still present, and as the evening deepened, he could almost feel the distant, subterranean thrum begin to reawaken, a persistent vibration promising another sleepless night, and a continuing, profound dilemma. The very notion of peace seemed to recede further into the dark, mist-shrouded valley, swallowed by the rising crescendo of an innocent monk's unintended terror. Chapter 4. The Heresy of Disturbed Peace, the Abbey of St. Alcuin, having endured weeks of an omnipresent, rumbling torment, experienced a fleeting, almost ethereal whisper of relief when Brother Balthazar was finally relocated to the scriptorium tower. This ancient stone edifice, once the domain of diligent scribes and the hush-turning of parchment, stood at the abbey's furthest northern reach, its walls reputedly thicker, its isolation profound. For the monks in the main dormitory, the initial nights were indeed a balm. The monstrous, guttural roar that had once shaken their very bones and rattled the small glass panes in their windows seemed to recede, replaced by a much softer, more distant thrum, a barely perceptible vibration that felt almost like a fading memory rather than a present threat. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Brother Thomas slept a full, uninterrupted night, waking with a start, convinced he had died and gone to heaven, only to be mildly disappointed to find himself still within the earthly confines of St. Alcuin. Brother Anselm's eye, twitch, subsided to a mere flutter, and Brother Gregory, the chronicler, found his hand steadier, his illuminated initials regaining their former precision, albeit still tinged with a lingering, anxious haste. However, this respite, precious as it was, proved to be an illusion, a cruel trick of sound waves and ancient stone. While the dormitory experienced a reprieve, the rest of the monastery began to learn the true, insidious nature of Brother Balthazar's nightly performance. The scriptorium tower, it turned out, acted less as an insulator and more as a gigantic resonant chamber, amplifying and focusing the vibrations into the very foundations of the abbey. The thrum, once diffuse, now seemed to possess a directional intensity, flowing through the stone like an underground river of sound. The vibrations traveled through the very earth, up through the flagstones of the cloister, and into the refectory, the chapter house, and even, most disconcertingly, the hallowed ground of the church itself. The sound was no longer just lauding, it was everywhere. It became a constant low-frequency pressure that hummed through their teeth as they ate, buzzed in the very air as they chanted, and vibrated through the pages of their sacred texts, making the words dance before their tired eyes. The initial fragile hope that Balthazar's removal would solve their woes quickly dissolved into a deeper, more profound despair. It became clear that this was not merely a matter of proximity, but of a force emanating from Brother Balthazar that defied conventional understanding. The monks, their brief taste of restful sleep, now a taunting memory, grew increasingly gaunt. Their patience frayed, their once gentle dispositions replaced by a collective, simmering resentment. Whispers began to morph into grumbling, and grumbling into thinly veiled accusations, all directed, implicitly, at the unwitting Brother Balthazar. How could such a seemingly pious man be the source of such widespread, persistent torment? It was in this atmosphere of sleep-deprived desperation and growing unease that the senior monks, particularly Prior Alaric, began to actively explore a darker, more troubling explanation. The abbot's initial charitable disposition towards Balthazar's innocence was now severely tested by the unrelenting pressure of his beleaguered flock. Father Abbot Ignatius, though still striving for compassion, found himself succumbing to the creeping suspicion that this might not be a simple malady. After all, Celera Benedict's inquiries with the local physician had yielded nothing but perplexed shrugs and dubious recommendations of leeches or herbal poultices made from obscure roots that smelled suspiciously like common turnip greens. These remedies, when applied during Balthazar's brief waking hours, had no effect whatsoever on his nocturnal symphony. The problem, it seemed, was not of the body, at least not in any way a mortal physician understood. Thus, the focus shifted from the corporeal to the spiritual, a perilous journey into the murky depths of medieval theological interpretation. Prior Alaric, a man for whom the sacred rule was an unbending iron rod, convened private, intense discussions with Father Abbot Ignatius and Novice Master Cuthbert. He brought forth ancient, dusty treatises from the abbey's seldom consulted theological library, texts penned by long-dead scholars and austere desert fathers, treatises that dissected every conceivable sin and its potential earthly manifestation. Abbot Prior Alaric began one damp afternoon in the chapter house, the air still thick with the subtle vibration from the distant tower. The very essence of monastic life is silence. It is in silence that one hears the whisper of God. It is in silence that contemplation flourishes, that prayer ascends, and that the soul finds repose from the clamor of the world. What then are we to make of a brother whose very slumber, a state meant for restorative quietude, instead generates a cacophony that drowns out the very voice of God in our ears? Novice Master Cuthbert, ever hesitant to condemn, interjected, but Prior, Brother Balthazar is not creating this noise with intent. He sleeps soundly, unaware. How can an unwitting act be a spiritual failing? Prior Alaric's lean face hardened. Intent is not always required for spiritual contamination. Novice Master, a vessel may be pure, yet carry pestilence. Consider the demon. It does not ask for permission to enter a body. It seeks a weakness, a crack, a spiritual impurity, however small, through which it may gain purchase. And once inside, it may twist the most innocent of bodily functions into a weapon of spiritual warfare. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. the constant unsettling rumble, the shaking of the sacred candles, the fallen crucifix. Are these not the very hallmarks of demonic disturbance, a desecration wrought by an unseen hand, using our own brother as an unwitting instrument? This argument, while terrifying, resonated deeply with the sleep-deprived monks. Their minds, dulled by exhaustion, were ripe for extreme interpretations. Brother Gregory, tasked by the abbot to continue his research into unusual monastic afflictions, found himself delving into increasingly obscure and unsettling texts. He unearthed a fragmented homily from a long-forgotten bishop of the 9th century, a man known for his extreme asceticism, which declared that excessive and boisterous exhalations during the time of rest are a sign of a soul yet bound to the earthly desires of the flesh, for true spiritual lightness grants effortless silent slumber. Gregory presented this finding with trembling hands, the words a chilling indictment. Another text, a treatise on the 7 deadly sins by a medieval scholastic, elaborated on the subtle manifestations of gluttony and sloth. It posited that while obvious overeating was a sin, a heaviness of the spirit, a lack of self-control even in sleep, could be its insidious byproduct. For a truly temperate soul, the text argued, the body itself becomes disciplined, even in unconsciousness. A spirit, unburdened by carnal excess, floats effortlessly on the gentle breath of God, whereas a soul laden with earthly attachments will drag the body into a noisy, turbulent slumber, disturbing the peace of all around it. The implication was clear. Balthazar's snoring, though involuntary, was a physical manifestation of an underlying spiritual imperfection, perhaps a deep-seated gluttony of spirit, or an egregious sloth that extended even into his most vulnerable hours. The most damning arguments, however, came from a collection of pronouncements against various heresies. While none directly mentioned snoring, Prior Alaric expertly drew parallels. The heretic, he declaimed during one particularly heated discussion, his voice vibrating with righteous indignation, disturbs the peace of the church not only by word but by spirit. If a man's very being, even in sleep, is so disruptive, so jarring, so utterly antithetical to the silence and order of our holy rule, then how is he not, by his very presence, enacting a form of spiritual heresy? He poisons the air. He shakes the very foundations of our devotion. He makes a mockery of our sacred rites by forcing a dance upon our candles. This is not mere noise, Abbott. This is a constant physical assault on the spiritual well-being of the entire community. It is a rebellion against order. And rebellion, Abbott, is the very definition of heresy. Father Abbot Ignatius wrestled with these arguments. He had always prided himself on his balanced judgment, his capacity for charity. But the evidence, however circumstantial by modern standards, was mounting. The monks were at their breaking point. Their prayers were fragmented. Their studies suffered. The very purpose of St. Alcuin's, to be a haven of silence and contemplation, was being utterly undermined. The distinct resonant hum that traveled from the scriptorium tower was a constant, mocking reminder of their torment. It was not enough that Balthazar was isolated. The he effecti of Balthazar was still pervasive. Brother Gregory, in a moment of desperate inspiration, found a short passage in an apocryphal text describing a saint who, through extreme piety, achieved a state of such spiritual lightness that he slept without breath or sound, his body becoming almost ethereal. This Alaric seized upon, twisting the narrative. If a saint could achieve oscillant sleep through piety, then Balthazar's Loudon sleep must be the antithesis, a sign of profound spiritual heaviness or corruption. The argument was circular, illogical to an outside observer, but to men driven to the brink by sleepless nights and the pervasive fear of spiritual contamination, it held a terrible, compelling logic. The concept of the heresy of disturbed peace began to solidify. It was not a formal heresy, not yet, but a practical one, born of desperation and medieval theological creativity. It argued that any prolonged, profound disturbance that actively undermined the spiritual discipline and communal harmony of a holy order, even if unwittingly perpetrated, carried the taint of heresy. It was a rejection of the peace God intended for his servants. The fact that Balthazar seemed so utterly pure in his waking hours only deepened the sinister implications. He was either a vessel for unseen forces, or his innocence was a cunning guise for a deeper, more insidious spiritual flaw. The sheer physical magnitude of his snoring, its ability to shake stone and make light dance, lent it a supernatural, malevolent quality in their minds. Father Abbot Ignatius's left eye, now a permanent, frantic flutter, looked out at his community during morning mass, their faces pale, their heads nodding involuntarily in exhaustion. He knew he had to act decisively. Charity was a virtue, but the salvation of his entire flock, their ability to continue their sacred duties, was paramount. The debate had moved beyond mere annoyance to a question of spiritual survival. The very air in the Abbey of St. Alcuin felt heavy, not just with mist, but with the unspoken, terrifying question: was Brother Balthazar, in his profoundly innocent slumber, an unwitting instrument of the devil himself? The stage was set, not for a medical intervention or a simple relocation, but for a trial of a man whose only discernible sin was the profound, earth-shaking sound of his own peaceful repose. The next step, Father Abbot Ignatius knew with a crushing certainty, would be terrible indeed. Chapter 5. The trial by silence, the strategic relocation of Brother Balthazar to the Scriptorium Tower, a move conceived by Father Abbot Ignatius as a desperate measure to salvage the Abbey of St. Alcuin's peace, proved to be less a solution and more an unfortunate amplification. While the main dormitory did indeed experience a brief, almost miraculous lull in the earth-shaking nocturnal symphony, this quietude was merely the fleeting calm before a far more localized and intense storm. The ancient, thick walls of the tower, rather than dampening the sound, seemed to channel it, transforming the scriptorium's venerable structure into a gargantuan resonator. The once diffuse rumble now possessed a sharper, more focused intensity, a seismic pulse that thrummed through the very bedrock upon which the abbey stood, radiating outward through the cloister, up the stairwells, and into every sacred chamber. It was as if the entire monastery had become a giant, distressed beast, its groans and rumbles emanating from a single unwitting heart. The monks, their initial relief quickly curdled into a deeper, more profound sense of betrayal, now understood that Balthazar's presence was not merely a matter of proximity. It was a pervasive, inescapable force that defied architectural solutions and threatened the very sanity of their community. Their sleep, briefly teased with tranquility, now plunged into an even more fractured state, haunted by the memory of silence, and plagued by the undeniable physical vibration that now seemed to follow them everywhere, a constant bass note beneath the surface of their lives. The monastic rule, comprehensive in its wisdom, offered no clear guidelines for dealing with a brother whose involuntary exhalations could dislodge prayer books and shatter the communal peace. The initial attempts at medical intervention, orchestrated by Cellarer Benedict, had been comically futile. The traveling physician, a portly man whose remedies consisted primarily of aggressive purges and the strategic application of leeches, had observed Balthazar for a single night from a cautious distance, emerging in the morning with a face ashen as a fresh plaster cast. He had mumbled something about an unprecedented congestion of the humors, and recommended a concoction of boiled nettle and donkey's milk, to be imbibed thrice daily. Brother Balthazar, ever compliant, drank the foul brew with serene indifference, his nights remaining as thunderous as ever. The physician, claiming a sudden and urgent summons to a distant village plagued by a similar though presumably less seismic, ailment, departed St. Alcuin's with uncharacteristic haste, leaving behind a hefty bill and a lingering scent of despair. With worldly remedies exhausted, and the monastic community on the verge of spiritual and physical collapse, Father Abbott Ignatius, under the increasing pressure from Prior Alaric and the desperate pleas of his sleep-deprived flock, conceded that the matter had ascended beyond the realm of the mundane. It was, he reluctantly concluded, a spiritual malady, a test of faith, or, as Prior Alaric increasingly argued with zealous conviction, a manifestation of the insidious heresy of disturbed peace. The abbot, his own left eye now a frantic, uncontrollable flutter, knew he could no longer afford the luxury of compassion without action. The very soul of St. Alcuin's was at stake. Thus began the trial by silence, a series of increasingly absurd and desperate tests designed not to cure Brother Balthazar but to definitively discern the nature of his affliction. Was it an unwitting conduit for demonic influence, a physical manifestation of a profound spiritual failing, or, as novice Master Cuthbert still faintly hoped, a peculiar and misunderstood divine resonance? The trials were conducted in the scriptorium tower itself, a grim theater of exhaustion and escalating paranoia, where Brother Balthazar surprisingly remained utterly calm, his beatific smile unwavering even as his brethren, pale and gaunt, circled him like a pack of nervous wolves. The first ordeal, proposed by Prior Alaric with an air of grim determination, was the ordeal of the sacred waters. A large, beautifully carved wooden font, usually reserved for baptisms in the village church, was brought to the scriptorium tower, filled with water, blessed by the abbot himself. Around its rim, a circle of consecrated salt was carefully laid. The theory, as articulated by Alaric, was simple. If a demonic entity truly inhabited Balthazar, or if his affliction was born of spiritual impurity, the blessed water would react. It would boil, perhaps, or emit a noxious fume, or turn black as pitch, revealing the evil it sought to repel. Brother Balthazar was instructed to drink a measure of the holy water before bed, and then his cot was placed directly beside the font. He complied with innocent alacrity, remarking only on the refreshing coolness of the water. That night, as the monks, gathered just outside the tower door, pressed their ears to the cold stone, the deep, resonant rumble began as usual. Inside, the blessed water remained utterly pristine, reflecting the flickering candlelight with serene indifference. Not a single bubble disturbed its surface, not a whisper of steam rose from its depths. Yet the entire font, a heavy object carved from oak, began to shiver almost imperceptibly, its wooden edges humming against the stone floor. It was a subtle vibration, but unmistakable, and far from the demonic reaction they had hoped for. It merely solidified the terrifying truth. The noise was so potent it could make even holy objects tremble without sullying them. The monks slumped away, defeated and more bewildered than ever. The test had yielded no sign of evil, only proof of an unsettling physical force. Next came the ordeal of the blessed relics, a more desperate measure. A collection of the monastery's most sacred relics was brought forth. A splinter of bone reputed to be from St. Alcuin himself, a small, desiccated finger bone of an obscure martyr, a scrap of faded cloth said to have touched the vestments of a long-dead bishop, and even a minuscule shard of what was claimed to be a fragment of the true cross, encased in a tarnished silver reliquary. These precious objects, normally guarded with utmost reverence, were arranged around Brother Balthazar's cot, some even placed directly upon his sleeping form. The logic was that a demon, or any unholy spiritual influence, would be violently repelled by such potent holy objects, forcing the snoring to cease or revealing the entity within. That night, the air in the tower seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. The monks, watching from the darkness beyond a strategically placed screen, held their breath, waiting for a gasp, a cessation of the sound, anything. But Brother Balthazar, undisturbed by the relics resting upon his chest and limbs, merely shifted, and his magnificent snore, if anything, seemed to deepen in resonant quality. One by one, the smaller, less stable relics, particularly the fragment of the true cross on its delicate chain, began to vibrate, then to shimmy. Then with a delicate, almost musical clink, they slid from his body onto the stone floor. The martyr's finger bone rolled innocently into a corner, and the scrap of cloth fluttered gently to the ground. The great snore continued, oblivious, sacrilegious in its very indifference. The monks stared, horrified. Not only had the relics failed to repel any evil, but they had been dislodged by the sheer force of Balthazar's slumber. It was as if his unconscious body actively rejected the holy, not with malice, but with a profound geophysical reality. Some of the younger monks began to wonder if the relics themselves were losing their power, a thought quickly suppressed as dangerously heretical in itself. The vigil of silent prayer was the last, most spiritually demanding test. For an entire night, Father Abbot Ignatius, Prior Alaric, Novice Master Cuthbert, and Brother Gregory, along with several other senior monks, gathered in the scriptorium tower, kneeling in a circle around Brother Balthazar's cot. Their mission was to collectively focus their spiritual energy, their unwavering faith, and their most fervent prayers, specifically targeted at silencing the infernal sound, expelling any dark influence, or, conversely, drawing out any hidden divine meaning. They recited psalms in their minds, offered silent supplications, and meditated on images of perfect peace and holy silence. The air grew thick with their combined exhaustion and desperate hope. But as the hours dragged on and the pervasive guttural rumble continued its relentless assault, the monks found their focus shattering. Their minds, deprived of sleep for weeks, rebelled. Brother Gregory, mid-silent prayer, found himself involuntarily swaying in rhythm with Balthazar's exhalations, his inner chant morphing into a strange, resonant hum. Novice Master Cuthbert, despite his best efforts, nodded off several times, jerking awake with a faint snort that was eerily similar to a miniature version of the sound he was trying to suppress. Prior Alaric, rigid in his determination, found his teeth chattering not from cold, but from the vibrations that passed through the very floor beneath his knees. Even Father Abbot Ignatius, his face a mask of spiritual agony, felt his own breathing subtly align with the deep, slow rhythm of Balthazar's sleep, a terrifying, involuntary synchronicity. By the time dawn broke, gray and unforgiving, the monks were utterly defeated. They had failed to silence Balthazar. And worse, they had failed to maintain their own spiritual discipline in the face of his overwhelming physical presence. Some even confessed, shamefacedly, that they had briefly entertained the thought of stuffing Brother Balthazar's mouth with hay. The cumulative failure of these trials, far from exonerating Brother Balthazar, served only to deepen the monk's conviction that his snoring was not merely an inconvenience, but a profound spiritual threat. The fact that he remained untouched by holy water, unmoved by relics, and impervious to collective prayer, all while remaining utterly oblivious and blissfully serene, twisted the knife of their fear. His innocence, once a comforting thought, now seemed the most sinister aspect of all. It suggested not a physical ailment, nor even a simple demonic possession that could be cleansed, but something far more insidious, a fundamental, perhaps innate, spiritual corruption so deep that it manifested physically without his knowledge or intent. He was not acting heretical, he was heresy, embodied in the most mundane yet devastating of human functions. The arguments of Prior Alaric gained unstoppable momentum. If a monk's very existence, even in unconsciousness, so utterly defied the foundational principles of monastic life, silence, peace, spiritual order, then how could he be permitted to remain within the holy walls? It was a practical heresy, a heresy of disruption, a constant living challenge to the harmony of God's house. His snoring was not just noise. It was a physical sermon of chaos, a sonic rebellion against divine order. The abbot, broken by sleeplessness and the desperate pleas of his flock, saw the truth, or at least the only path forward. The Abbey of St. Alcuin, a bastion of quiet contemplation, was becoming a mockery, its purpose undermined, its inhabitants driven to the brink of madness. Something had to be done. The spiritual purity of the monastery, and the well-being of his remaining monks, now outweighed the charity he felt for Brother Balthazar. The decision, though it tore at his weary soul, was inevitable. Brother Balthazar, in his profoundly innocent, earth-shaking slumber, would have to be confronted not as a suffering brother, but as a living, breathing, deeply resonant threat to the very essence of St. Alcuin's. The trial by silence had proven nothing, yet, paradoxically, it had proven everything. Chapter 6. The Witnesses of the Night. The morning after the disastrous trial by silence dawned. Not with the usual gentle illumination, but with a gray, bruised light that seemed to merely deepen the shadows beneath the monks' eyes. The collective failure of their spiritual remedies, the inability of blessed water or sacred relics to quell Brother Balthazar's seismic slumber, had not, as one might expect, led to a more rational approach. Instead, it had solidified a terrifying conviction within the Abbey of St. Alcuin. Brother Balthazar's affliction was not merely a physical malady, nor a simple case of spiritual impurity. It was something far more insidious, something that defied the known laws of God and man, a force so potent that it could withstand the holiest of interventions while simultaneously emanating from a soul so outwardly innocent. The very serenity of Balthazar in the face of his own terrifying nocturnal emissions became a source of profound dread. His undisturbed sleep, his beatific smiles upon waking, now felt less like innocence and more like the chilling detachment of a vessel possessed by a power that scorned their piety and mocked their suffering. Father Abbot Ignatius, his face now permanently etched with the lines of perpetual fatigue, his left eye twitching with a frantic rhythm all its own, felt the weight of his office pressed down upon him with unbearable force. The abbey, once a sanctuary of contemplative quiet, was now a constant hum, a low-frequency drone that thrummed through the very foundations, vibrating the communion wine in the chalice and causing the parchment on the scribes' desks to shudder faintly. The monks, his beloved flock, were on the brink of collapse. Their temperaments, once gentle, were now brittle. Their prayers, once fervent, were now fragmented whispers of desperation. The insidious heresy of disturbed peace, as Prior Relic now openly termed it, had taken root, poisoning the very air they breathed, a tangible presence born from the innocent exhalations of Brother Balthazar. In a grim attempt to bring some semblance of order to the escalating chaos, and to formally gather the evidence that would, he felt, inevitably lead to a terrible decision, Father Abbot Ignatius convened a special formal convocation in the small, rarely used chapter room of discernment. This chamber, usually reserved for the most delicate matters of monastic discipline or the reception of high-ranking church officials, was stark and unadorned, its stone walls providing no comfort, only a sense of solemnity. A single, flickering oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows, deepening the pallor of the assembled senior monks. Brother Balthazar, utterly unaware of the gravity of the proceedings, had been excused from attendance. Tending to the monastery's herb garden with his usual serene diligence, his hands meticulously weeding, his mind, presumably, focused on the nurturing of God's green bounty. One by one the monks were called forth to give their testimony. Not before a formal tribunal, but before their abbot and the senior brethren, their words recorded by Brother Gregory, whose quill hovered uncertainly over the fresh parchment. The testimonies, however, far from providing clarity, only serve to illustrate the profound and increasingly bizarre effects of sleep deprivation on the human mind. Each monk, in his own weary way, attempted to articulate the horror of the nightly ordeal. But their accounts, colored by exhaustion and fear, began to diverge into a disconcerting tapestry of subjective terror. Brother Thomas, still prone to waking convinced of the apocalypse, was the first to speak. His voice was hoarse, his eyes red-rimmed. "Abbott," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "It is as if the very gates of the inferno have opened beneath his cot. It begins as a low groan, like a monstrous beast stirring from its lair. Then it swells, a great, guttural roar that shakes the very stones. I have felt the ground tremble beneath me, Abbott, as if the earth itself groans in agony. It is the sound of damnation, I tell you, a sound that promises the end of all things. There are moments, when it reaches its crescendo, that I swear I can hear the lamentations of lost souls trapped within the sound, a chorus of despair emanating from his very throat." He collapsed back onto his bench, trembling, clutching his rosary. Next was Brother Anselm, whose nervous tic had returned with vengeance, causing his left eye to close and open rapidly, like a startled bird. "It is not just a roar, Abbott," he corrected, his voice tight with barely suppressed hysteria. "It is a grinding, a ceaseless, deliberate grinding, like the millstones of hell pulverizing the peace of God into dust. And sometimes, Abbott, sometimes I hear things. When the sound is at its most profound, when the air vibrates with its unholy power, I hear echoes, distant, mocking echoes, like a voice, deep and resonant, repeating something. Not words I understand, but a rhythm, a dark, pulsating rhythm that insinuates itself into your very thoughts. It makes me question my own sanity, Abbott Otti. Is it truly a sound or a corruption of the very air, a whisper from the adversary disguised as a snore? Brother Bartholomew, a man known for his calm and logical disposition, offered a more peculiar testimony. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if too weary for anything else. "The sound is consistent, Abbott, a rhythmic exhalation, profoundly loud. But the quality, it shifts. Sometimes it is the sound of a great wind, trapped within a cavern, howling. Other times it is a low, guttural croaking, like 1,000 frogs trapped beneath the earth, singing a dirge. And on occasion, particularly just before matins, when the body is most exhausted and the mind most vulnerable, I confess I have heard it. A faint, almost melodic undercurrent, like a distorted chant. A drone, yes, but a structured one. A patterning within the chaos, Abbott thought, as if something were being said, just beyond the reach of comprehension." He shuddered, and Prior Alaric leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with grim interest. But it was Brother Gregory, the monastery's chronicler, whose testimony proved the most unsettling, a perfect distillation of sleep-deprived delusion and pious dread. His hands, usually steady as he wrote, trembled uncontrollably, and he clutched his quill like a weapon. "Abbott," he exclaimed, his voice high and reedy, a stark contrast to the deep rumbling he described. "It is not merely noise. It is a symphony of profanity. At first it was, as Brother Thomas says, the wailing of the damned. Then it became a grinding, an endless lamentation. But then, Abbott, just last night, when the moon was high and the mist crept through the cloisters, I heard it, clear as a bell, woven into the very fabric of his breathing. Latin. Distorted, yes, but undeniably Latin. A hushed gasp rippled through the small chamber. Latin chants emanating from an unconscious monk's snore. This was a leap into the truly bizarre, a terrifying fusion of the sacred and the absurd. What What worries? Brother Gregory? Prior Alaric pressed, his voice taut with a strange mixture of horror and vindication. What blasphemies did you discern? Brother Gregory squeezed his eyes shut, as if recalling a nightmare. Fragments. Abbott. Broken phrases. Sometimes it sounds like the Idi's Irae, twisted and slowed as if sung by a choir of trolls in a deep cave. Other times, a distorted Yunkiri Ellison, prolonged and guttural, like a cow bellowing for its lost calf. But then, Abbott, a phrase I recognized clearly, repeated over and over, though warped by the sheer volume and unholy timbre of the sound. Pax vobiscum, sed non hit. Peace be with you, but not here. Over and over again. Like a malevolent mantra. He burst into a paroxysm of nervous coughs, his face ashen. Father Abbot Ignatius stared, aghast. Peace be with you, but not here. The words, whether truly heard or conjured from the abyss of Brother Gregory's sleep-deprived mind, resonated with a terrifying accuracy. It was indeed a constant state of not here for peace within St. Alcuin's. The abbot looked at his chronicler, then at Prior Alaric, whose expression was a grim mixture of triumph and profound disgust. Novice Master Cuthbert, ever the charitable soul, looked utterly bewildered, his brow furrowed in a knot of distress. Could an innocent snore truly be twisted by the mind into a blasphemous chant? Or was it, as Alaric believed, the undeniable sign of a more sinister influence, using Brother Balthazar's own pious vocabulary against them? The testimonies continued, each monk adding their own layer of hallucinatory detail. Brother Felix claimed the snoring sounded like the rhythmic beating of a demonic drum. Brother Bernard insisted he heard the faint, metallic clinking of unseen chains within the deepest growls, like a prisoner shuffling in a dungeon. Brother Cuthbert, though still advocating for Balthazar's inherent goodness, admitted that at times the sound reminded him of the mournful bellow of an ox being led to slaughter, a sound of profound animalistic suffering. The abbot listened to each account, the cumulative effect of profound disorientation. He wanted to cling to the notion of Brother Balthazar's innocence, to the idea that this was a medical affliction or a divine test. But how could so many different interpretations of the same sound, ranging from bestial roars to Latin chants, be explained by mere physical infirmity? The sheer variety of the perceived sounds, their descent into the specific imagery of torment, and most disturbingly twisted religious liturgy, suggested something beyond the mundane. It pointed to a spiritual contagion, a malevolent seed that seemed to have been planted in the very foundation of their abbey, spreading through the monks' minds like a virulent fever. Prior Alaric, seizing the moment, rose from his seat. Abbot, he declared, his voice cutting through the heavy air, the evidence is overwhelming. Whether by design or unwitting conduit, Brother Balthazar is a source of profound spiritual disturbance. His very being, in sleep, is antithetical to the silence and peace required for monastic life. His involuntary exhalations have become a sermon of chaos, a physical manifestation of a spiritual corruption so deep that it twists the very words of God into blasphemies in the ears of the faithful. If we do not act, Abbot, if we continue to permit this heresy of disturbed peace, then the Abbey of St. Alcuin, and indeed our very souls, will be irrevocably lost. The abbot looked at the pale, exhausted faces of his monks. Their testimony, however outlandish, was deeply felt, born of genuine suffering. The Latin chants, the sounds of damnation, the constant vibrating dread, it was all real to them, and it was all undeniably emanating from Brother Balthazar. The once comforting thought of Balthazar's innocence had curdled into something horrifying. He was not merely an instrument of chaos, but an unconscious one, his purity making him a perfect, unwitting vessel for something deeply unsettled. The path forward, however terrible, had become horrifyingly clear. The physical manifestations had led to theological interpretations, and now the subjective horrors of the monks' tormented minds would dictate a judgment that would shake the very foundations of St. Alcuin's. The monastery of St. Alcuin, a bastion of quiet contemplation, now prepared for a decision that would redefine the very nature of monastic peace and the definition of a heretic. Chapter 7. The Anatomical Controversy. The Abbey of St. Alcuin, already a strained and fractured community after weeks of ceaseless bone-rattling reverberations and the recent, unsettling trial by silence, found itself on the cusp of an irrevocable decision. The cumulative testimony of the monks, a bizarre tapestry woven from sleep deprivation, genuine terror, and highly subjective auditory hallucinations, had painted a grim picture. Brother Balthazar, in his profoundly innocent slumber, was not merely a source of noise, but an unwitting conduit for chaos, a living embodiment of the heresy of disturbed peace. Father Abbott Ignatius, his left eye now a permanent, frantic flutter, felt the chill of that terrible conclusion settle deep within his weary soul. The monks, his once placid flock, were gaunt specters shuffling through their days, their minds plagued by phantom Latin chants and the lingering echoes of a monstrous subterranean groan. The monastic order, founded upon silence and contemplation, was crumbling under the weight of an earthly sound. It was into this atmosphere of heightened paranoia and theological extremity that a most unlikely figure arrived, a man who represented an entirely different lens through which to view the world, one unburdened by ancient prophecies or demonic fears. His name was Master Elias of Rouen, a physician of modest renown, though his reputation stemmed less from miraculous cures and more from a pragmatic, almost disarmingly straightforward approach to human ailments. He was portly, with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, and carried with him a worn leather bag that smelled faintly of dried herbs and something metallic, a scent quite alien to the incense-laden air of St. Alcuin's. Celara Benedict, ever the pragmatist, despite his own fraying nerves, had, weeks prior, dispatched a runner to the nearest market town, requesting the services of any learned man who might possess knowledge of ailments beyond the spiritual. He had hoped for a miracle, or at least a purgative that truly worked. What he received was Master Elias, a man whose approach was less about humors and more about inconvenient anatomical truths. Master Elias had arrived at the abbey under a sky heavy with the promise of rain, his mule plodding wearily, its hooves echoing too loudly in the strained quietude of the monastery courtyard. The monks, huddled in doorways, regarded him with a mixture of suspicion and a sliver of desperate hope. He was led directly to Father Abbott Ignatius, who, after a brief, strained conversation detailing the unique affliction of Brother Balthazar, directed him to the scriptorium tower. Brother Balthazar, still oblivious to the existential crisis he embodied, was found diligently illuminating a manuscript, his brow furrowed in concentration, his tongue tracing the delicate curve of a gilded initial, entirely unaware of the dramatic implications of his nightly repose. He greeted Master Elias with his usual serene smile, offering him a seat and inquiring politely about his journey. Master Elias, a man accustomed to the strange and often unhygienic realities of the human body, observed Brother Balthazar with a quiet intensity. He felt his pulse, a steady, unremarkable rhythm. He peered into his eyes, clear and untroubled. He asked Brother Balthazar to open his mouth, and examined his throat with the aid of a small, polished metal tool, a process which caused Brother Balthazar to cough once apologetically. He noted Brother Balthazar's general robustness, his healthy complexion, his somewhat thick neck, and the slight curve of his spine when seated. His questions were simple, direct, and entirely concerned with the physical. "Do you ever wake feeling out of breath?" "No, never." "Do you experience dryness in the mouth upon waking?" "Occasionally, but no more than others." Do you suffer from recurring coughs or congestion? Only in the deepest winter. Like all men, Brother Balthazar answered each inquiry with guileless honesty, his gentle demeanor utterly at odds with the terror he unwittingly inflicted. The true examination, of course, had to take place at night. Master Elias, accompanied by Father Abbott Ignatius, Prior Alaric, and Brother Gregory, who was tasked with recording the physician's observations, a duty he approached with morbid fascination, settled into the scriptorium tower, strategically placed behind a heavy tapestry, far enough from Brother Balthazar's cot to allow observation, yet close enough to experience the full, unadulterated force of his slumber. The initial hours of the night passed in a state of tense anticipation. Then, as the monastic bells tolled for midnight, it began. First a low, hesitant rumble, like distant thunder. Then a rising crescendo, a guttural roar that made the very stones of the tower vibrate, a sound that pushed against the eardrums and settled deep in the chest. Father Abbot Ignatius pressed a hand to his temple, his eye twitching furiously. Prior Alaric stiffened, his jaw set. Brother Gregory's quill hovered, unable to capture the sheer physical presence of the sound. Master Elias, however, remained calm. He leaned forward, his spectacles glinting in the faint lamplight, listening intently. He repositioned himself, attempting to discern the exact origin of the sound. He placed a hand on the stone wall, feeling the resonant vibration. He even, to the horror of Prior Alaric, leaned closer to Brother Balthazar's unconscious form, listening to the very breaths that issued forth. After what felt like an eternity, but was perhaps only an hour, Master Elias retreated, nodding thoughtfully. He did not look perturbed, nor did he look particularly surprised. This lack of dramatic reaction was, in itself, unsettling to the monks. The dawn eventually broke, and Brother Balthazar, as always, awoke refreshed and beaming, completely unaware of the auditory apocalypse he had unleashed, or the grave faces of the men who had spent the night enduring it. Later that morning, in the chapter room of discernment, Master Elias presented his findings. The assembled monks, their faces pale and drawn, leaned forward, a fragile hope flickering in their sleep-deprived eyes. They expected talk of humors, of imbalances, perhaps even a cautious nod to unseen forces. Esteemed Father Abbot, Venerable Prior, Brothers, Master Elias began, his voice clear and uninflected, utterly devoid of the dramatic flair they had come to associate with their own suffering. I have observed Brother Balthazar. I have felt the vibrations he produces. I have listened intently to the sounds that issue forth from him during his repose. And I can tell you with certainty that this is not a matter of the humors being unbalanced, nor is it a malady of the spirit, nor, most assuredly, is it the work of any infernal agency. A collective, nervous rustle went through the room. Prior Alaric's eyes narrowed. Brother Balthazar, the physician continued, oblivious to the rising tension, suffers from what we physicians term a significant obstruction of the upper airway during sleep. When a man lies upon his back, the muscles of his throat and palate relax, as do the tissues of the tongue. For most men, this relaxation is slight, causing only a gentle, rhythmic breathing. However, in some, particularly those of a more robust constitution, or those with a naturally thicker neck or a predisposition to certain anatomical configurations, these relaxed tissues can partially block the passage of air. As air is then forced through this narrowed opening, it causes the soft palate, the uvula, and sometimes even the base of the tongue to vibrate. This vibration produces a sound. The louder the sound, the greater the obstruction. He paused, then went on explaining with dry precision. Brother Balthazar, as I have observed, possesses a remarkably robust anatomy. His palate appears to be quite substantial, and his nasal passages, while clear, seem designed to amplify rather than diminish any such vibration. When he lies upon his back, as is common in sleep, the relaxation is considerable. The sheer volume of air he draws in, combined with the significant resistance from these relaxed tissues, creates a powerful vibration that resonates throughout his entire being. This resonance then transmits through the very floor beneath him, through the stone walls, and indeed, through the ground upon which the abbey is built. It is a purely mechanical phenomenon, a matter of flesh, air, and unfortunate anatomical arrangement. He even offered a simple diagram, scratched hastily on a piece of parchment, a rudimentary drawing of a head in profile, with arrows indicating airflow, and a crude representation of a vibrating soft palate. It was clinical, mundane, and utterly devoid of spiritual poetry. The silence that followed Master Elias's explanation was not the blessed silence the monks craved, but a thick, oppressive stillness, heavy with disbelief. Prior Alaric, his face a mask of indignation, was the first to speak, his voice a low growl. A mechanical phenomenon. Unfortunate anatomical arrangement. Master Physician, are you suggesting that the wailing of the damned, the shaking of our sacred candles, the very falling of the crucifix, are merely the consequence of a fleshy obstruction? Are you so blind to the spiritual reality that pervades our world? Master Elias adjusted his spectacles. Reverend Prior, I am a man of flesh and humors, not of spirits and demons. My observations are based on what I can see, hear, and feel of the human body. The sounds you describe, the lamentations of lost souls, the Latin chants, these are, with all due respect, likely the manifestations of minds exhausted by lack of proper rest. The human mind, deprived of sleep, can conjure most vivid auditory and visual illusions. The vibrations you feel are real, but they are physical vibrations, not spiritual ones. Your candle swayed because the sound waves, being powerful, created a physical disturbance in the air, a physical pressure. The crucifix fell because a vibratory force, however subtle, eventually dislodges anything not firmly affixed. This is not witchcraft nor demonry, it is physics. Physics, spat Prior Alaric, rising to his feet, his indignation swelling. Are you suggesting, Master Physician, that centuries of theological understanding, that the very clear signs of demonic influence are naught but the physics of a man's breathing? This is blasphemy. This trivializes the very suffering we have endured, the spiritual warfare we have fought. This is an insult to God, who tests us and sends us signs. Cellarer Benedict, though his hope had been dashed, found a flicker of sympathy for the physician. But Master Elias, the sound is so immense. We have never heard its like. Could such a thing truly be merely anatomical? Indeed, Master Elias affirmed calmly. The unique combination of Brother Balthazar's particular anatomy and the remarkable acoustics of your venerable abbey, which seems to act as a colossal resonator, has created a sound of truly exceptional volume. It is rare, certainly, but not, to my mind, supernatural. Father Abbott Ignatius, torn between the simple, undeniable logic of the physician and the overwhelming, terrifying conviction of his monks, remained silent. His left eye twitched, his heart ached. The physician's explanation, while rational, failed to account for the eye-felt irreality of the monk's torment. It stripped away the grand spiritual narrative that had helped them frame their suffering, replacing it with something so mundane, it felt like a profound betrayal. If it was just physics, then their exhaustion, their terror, their whispered Latin chants were all just symptoms of their own weakness, their own fragile minds. This was almost more humiliating than a demonic possession. Brother Gregory, his quill now still, looked up, his eyes wide with a fresh, terrible thought. But Master Elias, if it is merely physics, and if such a mundane thing can cause such profound spiritual disturbance, shaking relics and causing men to hear demonic Latin chants, then is that not in itself a form of demonic deception? To make the natural appear so unsettling that it drives God's servants to despair and accusation. To hide the devil's work in the guise of mere Anatomical configuration. The physician sighed, a sound of profound world-weariness. Brother, I speak only of the body. The mind, especially a tired one, will interpret what it wills. I cannot speak to the intentions of the adversary, should he exist. I only speak to the mechanics of sound. This argument, the idea that the devil could hide behind physics to create spiritual chaos, resonated far more powerfully with the monks than the physician's simple explanation. It provided a new, even more insidious dimension to Balthazar's torment. It turned the physician's rational words into a clever trap, a deception. Then, Master Elias, Prior Alaric declared, his voice ringing with renewed conviction, your explanation, while purporting to be of the natural world, only serves to confirm the unnaturalness of the affliction. For if a simple bodily function can wreak such havoc, driving men to hallucinate blasphemies and shaking the very stones of God's house, then it is clear that a malevolent force is at play, using this brother, this anatomical configuration, as its instrument. Your physics is merely the devil's new guise. Master Elias, sensing the futility of further rational discourse, merely bowed his head. He had encountered such unyielding faith, or rather, such unyielding superstition before. He gathered his instruments, the metallic clinking sounding strangely sharp in the charged air. He departed St. Alcuin's shortly thereafter, leaving behind his diagram of a vibrating pallet, a testament to his simple observable truth, which was promptly burned by Prior Alaric as a dangerous, heretical document that sought to deny the spiritual reality of their suffering. The brief candle of hope for a mundane solution had been extinguished, leaving the Abbey of St. Alcuin shrouded once more in its self-imposed spiritual gloom, now deepened by a new, more terrible certainty. The physician's visit, far from bringing clarity, had merely strengthened the monk's conviction that Brother Balthazar was not just a medical anomaly, but a spiritual one, an unwitting agent of chaos whose very existence disturbed the divine peace. His innocence was now interpreted not as purity, but as the perfect cover for insidious unseen forces. The heresy of disturbed peace was no longer a theory. It was the horrifying truth. And the monks, driven to the brink by exhaustion and fear, knew that the time for desperate measures had finally arrived. The next steps, they understood with a collective dread, would be terrible, and would irrevocably alter the fate of Brother Balthazar, the seemingly pious monk who snored so loud he shook the very foundations of their faith. Chapter 8. The Heretic's New Habit. The Abbey of St. Alcuin, a place once synonymous with profound quietude, had become a theater of psychological warfare, waged nightly by the unwitting Brother Balthazar. The trial by silence, far from bringing clarity, had merely plunged the monastic community into a deeper abyss of bewildered paranoia. Master Elias of Rouen, the pragmatic physician, had departed the valley with a frustrated sigh. His rational explanation of vibrating soft palates and peculiar anatomical arrangements dismissed by Prior Alaric as a dangerous, thinly veiled heresy, a cunning stratagem by the adversary to disguise malevolent spiritual influence within the mundane. The monks, now convinced that Balthazar's monstrous snoring was not merely a physical inconvenience, but a physical manifestation of spiritual corruption, a heresy of disturbed peace that defied blessed water and sacred relics, found themselves at the very precipice of despair. Their minds, battered by weeks of ceaseless vibration and phantom Latin chants, were no longer capable of discerning the rational from the absurd. Their days were a haze of exhaustion, their nights a torment of resonating stone and imagined damnation. Father Abbott Ignatius, his face a parchment of weariness, his left eye a frantic perpetual twitch, knew with a chilling certainty that the time for equivocation was over. Charity, cornerstone of his spiritual life, had to yield to the survival of his flock. The monastery, his beloved St. Alcuin's, was bleeding sanctity, its purpose undermined by the relentless, unconscious sound emanating from one of its purest souls. He spent a night in solitary vigil, not in prayer, for his mind was too muddled by the pervasive thrumming sound to focus, but in agonizing contemplation. He watched the stars, a cold, indifferent sprinkle across the black sky, and listened to the distant, earth-shaking rhythm that pulsed from the scriptorium tower, and a decision, heavy as a stone, settled in his soul. It was a decision that felt simultaneously unjust and utterly unavoidable. The following morning, after a truly fragmented matins, where several monks were seen openly weeping from exhaustion during the psalms, Father Abbot Ignatius summoned Brother Balthazar to his private chambers. Balthazar arrived, his cheeks rosy from the morning air, his eyes bright and untroubled, radiating an almost unnerving sense of peaceful contentment that grated on the abbot's frayed nerves. He bowed deeply, his usual gentle smile gracing his lips. "Brother Balthazar," the abbot began, his voice surprisingly firm, though it cracked on the second syllable. "We have observed you closely these past weeks. Your piety, your diligence, your devotion to our holy rule is beyond reproach. You are, in your waking hours, a model of monastic virtue." He paused, struggling to find the words to temper the blow that was to follow. "However, brothers, there is a matter of your repose. Your sleep, brother, has, through no fault of your own, caused a considerable disturbance within our holy walls. The brethren are suffering greatly. Our sacred duties are being hampered. The very peace of God which we strive to cultivate is being displaced." Brother Balthazar listened, his head cocked slightly, his brow furrowed in earnest perplexity. "Displaced, Abbot? I am truly sorry if my breathing causes any distraction. I strive for perfect quietude in all things." His sincerity was palpable, which only made the situation more tragically absurd. "It is not merely a distraction, brother," the abbot continued, a weariness seeping into his tone. "It is a profound, resonant sound that shakes our very foundations. It has caused the candles to sway, the crucifix to fall, and, in the minds of some brothers, it has even taken on the semblance of blasphemous chants." He averted his gaze, unable to meet Balthazar's guileless eyes. The consensus among the senior brethren, after much prayer and agonizing discernment, is that while your soul is pure, your nightly emanation is an unwitting conduit for spiritual disruption. A practical heresy, if you will, against the peace of God in this sacred place. Brother Balthazar's brow furrowed deeper, a faint blush rising on his cheeks. "A heresy? I assure you my dreams are of blessed fields and quiet prayers. We do not accuse you of intent, brother," the abbot clarified, "but of effect. And the effect, brother, is devastating. Therefore, after much deliberation, a decision has been made for the well-being of the entire community, and for the preservation of St. Alcuin's sacred quiet." The abbot took a deep breath. "You are to be relieved of your duties as a contemplative monk within the main abbey. You will henceforth be assigned to the care of the monastery's livestock. You will be stable boy. Brother Balthazar, don't. Your new cell will be in the small, rarely used room adjacent to the main stables, at the very edge of our monastic lands. It is a humble dwelling, far from the central abbey, and we pray that its remoteness will finally contain the unique resonance of your slumber." Brother Balthazar blinked, his calm demeanor wavering for a fraction of a second, but then, with a deep sigh that was, thankfully, perfectly silent, he bowed his head in acceptance. "As the abbot commands, so shall it be. I will serve God in whatever capacity he wills, be it prayer or the tending of his creatures. I only pray that my Affliction does not disturb the horses. His innocence, in that moment, was almost unbearable. He seemed genuinely more concerned about the animals than his own profound emotion. And so, Brother Balthazar shed the pristine habit of a cloistered monk for the rough, sturdy tunic of a stable boy. His new domain was a collection of low stone and timber buildings, redolent with the earthy aroma of hay, horse sweat, and manure. The air, far from the hallowed quiet of the abbey, was filled with the rustle of straw, the occasional stomp of a hoof, the soft whicker of a mare, and the persistent buzz of flies. His new duties were demanding, mucking out stalls, hauling water buckets from the well, grooming the monastery's few draft horses and milch cows, ensuring the sheep was safely penned, and mending fences. He approached each task with the same diligent, unassuming grace he had brought to illuminating manuscripts, his hands, once accustomed to delicate quills, now calloused and stained, yet still gentle. The senior monks watched his departure from the chapter room window, a collective sigh of something akin to relief passing through them. Prior Relic permitted himself a small, grim nod of satisfaction. Brother Gregory, however, felt a pang of unexpected pity for the serene monk, now reduced to the care of beasts. But the overriding sentiment was that, finally, peace would return to St. Alcuin's. The distant thrum from the scriptorium tower had ceased, replaced by the mundane sounds of stable life, a quiet hum of flies, and the distant lowing of a cow. That first night, the monks in the dormitory dared to hope. They stretched out on their cots, their ears strained, waiting for the familiar, dreaded rumble. And it did not come. Not from the dormitory, nor from the scriptorium tower. A profound, almost shocking silence settled over the main abbey, a palpable stillness that tasted of sweet, long-denied repose. For the first time in weeks, the abbey of St. Alcuin experienced true, uninterrupted quiet. The monks slept deeply, profoundly, their bodies aching with the glorious luxury of unconsciousness. Brother Thomas did not wake screaming of damnation. Brother Anselm's eye ceased its frantic tick. Brother Gregory dreamed of blank, tranquil parchment. But the silence in the main abbey was merely a displacement, a shifting of the epicenter of Balthazar's nightly symphony. For at the very edge of the monastic grounds, in the small, hay-scented room adjacent to the stables, Brother Balthazar settled onto his straw pallet, his hands clasped over his stomach, his face serene. And as sleep claimed him, the sound began. It started as a soft, almost purring rumble, barely distinguishable from the gentle movements of the large, drowsy animals in the stalls nearby. Then it deepened, a low, resonant drone that filled the stable space. A steady, rhythmic exhalation that vibrated through the timbers and the very earth beneath the straw. It was Brother Balthazar's snore, now amplified and contained within the wooden structure, a profound, continuous hum that made the very air vibrate. Yet the effect was, to the utter astonishment of the monastery's less sleep-deprived stable hands, entirely unforeseen. The monastery's horses, generally a skittish, restless lot prone to nervous whickering and impatient stumping, especially at night, now exhibited a profound, almost unnatural calm. Old Bess, a mare notorious for her nightly anxieties, would sink into a deep slumber, her flanks barely twitching, her breathing slow and even. Young Charger, a spirited stallion whose restless hooves had often kept the stable hands awake, would lie down, a rare feat for him, and drift off into a serene, deep sleep, his head resting peacefully in the straw. Ah! The cows in their stalls would chew their cud with a methodical, almost hypnotic rhythm, their eyes half closed, lulled by the pervasive thrum. Even the barn cats, usually nocturnal hunters, would curl into tight, furry balls near Balthazar's door, their small bodies vibrating with the sound, purring contentedly. The stable hands, initially confused, then cautiously amazed, began to notice the change. The horses, usually fractious in the morning, were now calm, well-rested, and remarkably docile during their daily tasks. They required less coaxing, pulled plows with greater ease, and even the milk from the cows seemed to flow more readily, a richer, creamier yield than before. The animals, once a source of constant minor worries, had become paragons of bovine and equine tranquility. Whispers of this strange phenomenon eventually reached the main abbey. Brother Bartholomew, the meticulous one, tasked with inspecting the stables for any signs of negligence from the new stable boy, initially dismissed the reports as fanciful. But then he saw it himself, a stable full of deeply sleeping, placid animals, their bodies rising and falling with the rhythm of a deep, resonant hum, a sound that here in the stables was almost soothing. He felt a strange internal vibration in his own bones, a low frequency that seemed to bypass his conscious fear and resonated with some primal, forgotten part of his being. He found himself on several occasions almost nodding off while checking the hay supply. Prior Alaric, upon hearing these reports, scoffed. The animals are simple beasts, susceptible to base influences. It is a trick, a perversion. No doubt the unholy sound appeals to their baser natures, lulling them into an unnatural docility. But even his stern, unyielding logic struggled to fully dismiss the undeniable evidence of the contented animals. The irony was bitter indeed. The man who terrorized men soothed beasts. Father Abbott Ignatius, still suffering from his chronic eye twitch despite the return of relative peace to the main abbey, would sometimes walk to the stables in the dead of night. He would stand outside Balthazar's humble cell, listening. The deep, resonant rumble, no longer a source of terror, but a strange rhythmic lullaby emanating from within. He would hear the soft, contented sighs of the horses, their deep, peaceful breaths, perfectly in sync with Balthazar's profound slumber. It was a paradox that defied all his theological training. How could such a disruptive force for man be a source of such profound peace for beasts? Was it that the animals, unburdened by complex thoughts and theological interpretations, perceived the sound purely as a vibration, a comforting thrum, while the human mind, burdened by expectation and fear, warped it into a terrifying cacophony? Or was it, as Prior Alaric suggested, a more sinister, subtle manipulation, a testament to Balthazar's peculiar heresy of disturbed peace that now extended its strange influence even to the natural world, lulling it into an unnatural placidity? The Abbey of St. Alcuin slept, for the most part, but the monks, though no longer plagued by the immediate shaking terror, were haunted by the knowledge that at the very edge of their holy ground, the man they had cast out as a source of spiritual chaos was now, inadvertently, cultivating a strange, animalistic peace. Brother Balthazar, the humble stable boy, continued to snore, his nightly symphony echoing through the hay-filled stalls, a testament to the absurd, ironic, and often profoundly baffling nature of existence, and the strange, unexpected places where peace, or at least a peculiar form of it, could sometimes be found. The main abbey may have found its silence, but it had lost something else: its ability to comprehend the strange, quiet mysteries of a monk who snored a heresy in one breath, and a lullaby in the next. Chapter 9. The miracle of the sleepless village. The Abbey of St. Alcuin, having banished the disruptive resonance of Brother Balthazar to the stables, now basked in a fragile, almost ethereal silence. The central dormitory, once a chamber of ceaseless seismic activity, hummed with a delicate quietude that felt both miraculous and deeply unsettling. The monks, their faces still etched with the lines of chronic exhaustion, and their eyes still prone to nervous darting, cautiously indulged in the rare luxury of uninterrupted sleep. Brother Thomas no longer jolted awake, convinced of the end of days, though he still occasionally twitched as if anticipating a phantom tremor. Brother Anselm's eye, while no longer twitching uncontrollably, remained prone to a subtle, almost imperceptible flutter, a ghost of the past torment. Brother Gregory, the chronicler, found his quill hand remarkably steady, his illuminated initials regaining their former intricate beauty, yet a lingering sense of unease gnawed at him. The silence, though welcome, felt hollow, purchased at the cost of a man's dignity, and tainted by the unresolved theological question of Balthazar's unique heresy of disturbed peace. The abbey's leadership, particularly Father Abbott Ignatius, found this newfound peace a complex burden. While the immediate suffering of the monks had abated, the abbot's left eye continued its frantic twitch, a physical manifestation of his internal turmoil. The vision, Master Elias, had presented a purely anatomical explanation for Balthazar's earth-shaking snore, attributing it to a robust anatomy and obstructed airways. This mundane explanation had been vehemently rejected by Prior Alaric, who, with chilling conviction, declared it a clever ruse by the adversary, a demonic deception masked by the language of physics to undermine their faith and trivialize their suffering. The monks, swayed by their collective trauma and the persuasive rhetoric of their prior, now firmly believed that Balthazar, in his innocent slumber, was an unwitting conduit for malevolent forces, his very existence a living affront to the sacred silence. His new role as stable boy, and the curious, calming effect his snoring had on the monastery's animals, had only deepened the mystery, twisting the theological knots tighter in their minds. How could a heretic of peace soothe beasts? It defied logic and perhaps even divine order. Despite the stable's newfound tranquility and the apparent docility of the animals, a fresh wave of anxiety began to ripple through the abbey. The stable hands, normally a gruff and pragmatic lot, had started to speak of Brother Balthazar in hushed, reverent tones, whispering of the brother who brings peace to the beasts. They spoke of the milk flowing more abundantly, of horses working with unprecedented calm, of a palpable sense of peace that settled over the stables each night. This was profoundly unsettling to the senior monks. The heresy of disturbed peace was one thing when it caused tremors and hallucinations, but a heresy of ague-soothing animals was a new, insidious twist. Prior Alaric, particularly agitated by these reports, saw it as further proof of a sinister spiritual influence. "It corrupts the natural order," he thundered in a private discussion with the abbot. "It perverts the very hierarchy of creation. Men are tormented, but beasts are lulled. This is unnatural, abbot, and therefore unholy. It is the devil's lure, making the profane appear peaceful, drawing simple souls away from the true, challenging path to God's silence." The abbot, desperate to resolve the lingering spiritual stain he felt Balthazar represented, and pressured by Alaric's escalating denunciations, made a final agonizing decision. Brother Balthazar, despite his unwavering piety and gentle nature, would have to be exiled from the abbey grounds entirely. It was not a formal excommunication, for his waking hours revealed no sin, but an banishment, a removal to the farthest reaches, where his affliction could no longer, hopefully, touch the consecrated ground of St. Alcuin's. And so, one crisp autumn morning, Brother Balthazar, still radiating an aura of serene innocence, was led by Cellarer Benedict and two stable hands beyond the abbey walls. He carried a small satchel containing his worn wooden crucifix, a prayer book, and a meager ration of dried bread and cheese. His habit, now worn and stained from his duties in the stable, clung loosely to his plump frame. He offered a gentle bow to Father Abbott Ignatius, who stood at the gate, his face a mask of profound sorrow and exhaustion, his eye twitching almost violently. "Go forth, Brother Balthazar," the abbot intoned, his voice heavy with a pain that mingled with relief, "and may God guide your path. Sic solus where you may find it. May your unique gift find a purpose that brings peace, not disturbance." He could not bring himself to meet Balthazar's innocent gaze. Brother Balthazar uttered, a faint, almost imperceptible sigh escaping his lips. As God wills, Abbott. I shall pray for the abbey and for its continued peace. And with that, the gentle monk, now no longer a monk in the formal sense, walked slowly down the winding path that led away from St. Alcuin's, his figure slowly receding into the mist that perpetually clung to the valley, a single unassuming silhouette carrying an immense unseen burden of sound. His destination was a decrepit, abandoned shepherd's shack, a tumble-down structure of moss-covered stone and rotting thatch situated at the very edge of the valley, perched on a low rise overlooking the nearest village. The village, simply known as Oakhaven, was a collection of perhaps 50 souls, nestled along the banks of a slow-moving river, its humble dwellings a patchwork of wattle and daub, timber and crude stone. It was a community that, unbeknownst to the monks of St. Alcuin's, suffered from its own pervasive, albeit less dramatic, affliction, a chronic, widespread insomnia. For generations, the villagers of Oakhaven had been a restless folk. The river, though gentle, possessed a subtle, rhythmic gurgle that seemed to seep into their very bones, preventing deep slumber. The wind, funneling down from the surrounding hills, whistled mournfully through ill-fitting doors and windows, carrying with it the imagined cries of ancient spirits. Their daily lives were filled with anxieties, the unpredictable harvest, the unpredictable Lord, the unpredictable illnesses, all contributing to a collective inability to truly rest. They tossed and turned. They sighed and groaned. They consumed endless cups of diluted herbal brews and chanted old wives' remedies. But the elusive balm of sleep always seemed to evade them. Their nights were long, weary vigils, their days marked by blurred vision, frayed tempers, and a pervasive, aching exhaustion. The village miller, a robust man named Thomas, found himself routinely counting the rotations of his millstones in the dark, his mind unable to shut off. Agnes, the village weaver, would lie awake listening to the rhythmic clicking of her own heart, envisioning endless threads unspooling into the darkness. Even the children, usually capable of sleeping through a thunderstorm, would stir restlessly, their small bodies twitching, their dreams troubled by unseen anxieties. Brother Balthazar, now simply Balthazar, the exiled monk, set about making the shack habitable with his usual quiet diligence. He patched holes in the walls with mud and straw, cleared out the accumulated debris, and fashioned a simple bed from a pile of dried leaves and scavenged cloth. He ate his meager rations, prayed his quiet prayers, and as dusk settled over Oakhaven, casting long shadows across the fields, he lay down upon his improvised pallet. And then, as the last rays of light faded and the first stars pricked the darkening sky, he fell asleep. The sound began, as it always did, as a low, almost tentative rumble. Then it swelled, a deep, resonant exhalation that filled the small shack, vibrating through its rickety timbers and out into the crisp night air. It was Balthazar's magnificent snore, untamed and unmuted, a profound, continuous thrum that pulsed outwards into the quiet valley. In the village of Oakhaven, the initial reaction was one of bewilderment. Old man Hemlock, a wizened shepherd, who often sat by his fire through the night, convinced that the world would fall silent if he closed his eyes, heard it first. A deep, steady drone, unlike the usual sounds of the night. It wasn't the rustle of leaves, or the gurgle of the river, or the mournful wind. It was a gwine sound, a continuous, low-frequency hum that seemed to press in on him from the direction of the abandoned shack on the rise. He found it odd, certainly, but not immediately alarming. He simply listened, a new distraction for his sleepless hours. Then, something peculiar happened. The rhythmic thrum, far from being irritating, began to insinuate itself into the very fabric of his consciousness. It was a steady, unchanging presence, a bass note that seemed to anchor the restless cacophony of his thoughts. The gurgle of the river, the whisper of the wind, the creaks of his old cottage, all seemed to recede, muffled by this pervasive, almost hypnotic drone. He found his breathing subtly slowing, syncing with the profound, deep rhythm of the sound. His eyes, usually wide and staring into the darkness, began to grow heavy. He fought it for a moment, out of habit, but the sound was too comforting, too pervasive. He slipped, for the first time in memory, into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning he awoke with a start, disoriented but remarkably refreshed. The world seemed brighter, his aches less acute. He rubbed his eyes, bewildered. He had slept. Truly slept. He was not alone. Throughout Oakhaven, a quiet revolution was unfolding. The miller, Thomas, who usually rose with the moon, found himself awakening only at the first rays of dawn, feeling inexplicably rested. The clatter of his thoughts replaced by a profound emptiness he couldn't recall experiencing before. Agnes the weaver stirred from a sleep so deep her limbs felt heavy. The nightmares that usually plagued her conspicuously absent. Eindrein. Nisselzeyes makitat mipter. Alflado miduki. Their faces, typically smudged with weariness, now played with an uncharacteristic vigor. At first they spoke of it in cautious whispers. "Did you sleep well last night?" "Yes, strangely well." The news spread like wildfire through the small community. They soon connected it to the new arrival in the old shepherd's shack, the exiled monk, the one who made a great noise at night. Curiosity soon outweighed apprehension. A few daring souls, suffering from particularly stubborn bouts of insomnia, decided to test the theory. They walked towards the shack after dark, keeping a respectful distance, and simply sat on the grass listening. The deep, resonant hum pulsed around them, a steady, unwavering force. And as they listened, their anxieties seemed to melt away, their eyelids grew heavy, and one by one, they succumbed to a profound restorative slumber, right there in the open air, under the indifferent stars. The reports that flowed back into Oakhaven were nothing short of miraculous. "He cured my sleeplessness. Deep sound. It makes the world quiet. It is like a lullaby, but for the very bones." The villages, unburdened by theological debates or the spiritual implications of disturbed peace, perceived Balthazar's snoring not as a destructive force, but as a soothing balm. For them, it was a constant, gentle hum, a form of natural white noise that drowned out the sharper, more jarring sounds of their restless nights and the internal clamor of their own anxieties. It was a profound, pervasive vibration that seemed to lull their very nervous systems into submission, guiding them effortlessly into the embrace of deep sleep. Soon, Oakhaven developed a peculiar nightly ritual. Those afflicted by sleeplessness, and indeed, many who simply sought a deeper, more profound rest, would gather on the gentle slope overlooking Balthazar's shack. They would lay out blankets, some even bringing their children, and simply settle down, listening to the magnificent, earth-shaking snore emanating from the humble dwelling. The sound, which had driven the monks of St. Alcuin to the brink of madness here in Oakhaven, was a blessing, a miracle. It was their nightly lullaby, the profound, rhythmic breath of a man who, unbeknownst to them, had been exiled for the very gift that now brought them peace. Tales of the miracle of the sleepless village eventually began to trickle back to the Abbey of St. Alcuin. Travelers, passing through Oakhaven on their way to the market, would stop at the monastery for refreshment, and in casual conversation speak of the strange, blessed sleep that had descended upon the village since the arrival of the humming monk in the shepherd's shack. The monks of St. Alcuin listened, their expressions a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and mounting horror. Father Abbott Ignatius, his eye twitching with renewed vigor, summoned Prior Alaric and Brother Gregory. "They speak of miracles, Brother Alaric," he exclaimed, his voice incredulous. "They claim his snoring brings them peace, that it cures their sleeplessness." Prior Alaric, his face a thundercloud of grim satisfaction, slammed his fist on the table. "Proof," he declared, his voice a triumphant roar. "Further proof of the insidious nature of this heresy. It is a demonic deception, Abbott, to make the profane appear sacred, to lull the simple-minded into a false sense of peace, thereby softening them for the devil's true work. It confirms the very essence of the heresy of disturbed peace. He disturbs the peace of the righteous, but soothes the unholy. It is a perversion of God's order, a mockery of his grace. His logic, though twisted, held a compelling, terrifying weight for the sleep-deprived monks. Brother Gregory, however, found himself increasingly torn. He remembered the physician's simple explanation of vibrating tissues. He remembered the serene animals in the stables, and now the peacefully sleeping villagers. He looked at the abbot, then at Alaric, and a profound, unsettling thought began to form in his mind. What if the heresy wasn't in Balthazar's snore, but in their own rigid interpretation of it? What if God's peace, and indeed God's truth, was more complex, more ironic, and certainly more absurd than their carefully constructed theological frameworks allowed for? But such thoughts were dangerous, even heretical in themselves, especially in the face of Prior Alaric's zealous conviction. The Abbey of St. Alcuin, now enjoying its quiet nights, remained stubbornly blind to the peaceful reality beyond its walls. They had banished their tormentor, only for him to become a reluctant savior to others. The irony was palpable, thick in the crisp night air, a silent counterpoint to the distant, earth-shaking lullaby emanating from the humble shack in Oakhaven. Brother Balthazar, the monk who snored a heresy, had inadvertently become the unwitting architect of a miracle, a peculiar, sonic blessing that defied the very definitions of sanctity and sin, proving that sometimes, in the most unlikely and mundane of forms, true peace could be found. But for the Abbey of St. Alcuin, the paradox of Balthazar's snoring had only deepened, a constant reminder of the strange, unyielding mysteries of existence, and the unsettling truth that what torments one may soothe another. Chapter 10. The canonization debate years, like slow, deliberate droplets of water, had accumulated in the basin of time since Brother Balthazar, the unwitting architect of both chaos and strange peace, had departed the hallowed grounds of St. Peace. Alcuin's. The abbey, once a living testament to quiet contemplation, had indeed settled into a profound and almost oppressive silence, a silence purchased at the cost of a man's belonging, and stained by the lingering questions of his unique affliction. Father Abbot Ignatius, his left eye finally at rest, had passed into the great silence of eternity some seasons prior, his final days marked by a weariness that even the abbey's newfound tranquility could not fully erase. Prior Alaric, the stern champion of order and the architect of Balthazar's exile, had ascended to the role of abbot, his rule marked by an unyielding adherence to the traditional monastic virtues, particularly that of unblemished quietude. The monks, no longer suffering the nightly seismic assaults, found their sleep deep and restorative. Yet a certain sterile quiet permeated their days, a quiet that lacked the gentle, humming vitality of a monastery truly at peace. Brother Gregory, the chronicler, now aged and his hands gnarled by years of copying, continued his meticulous work, his eyes often drifting to the empty page reserved for the final entry on Brother Balthazar, an entry he still found himself unable to complete. Meanwhile, at the very edge of the valley, the village of Oakhaven flourished, bathed in an almost preternatural calm. The humming monk, as Balthazar was affectionately known, had become a beloved fixture, his shepherd's shack a nightly pilgrimage site for the restless and the weary. His profound, rhythmic snore, once the harbinger of torment for the monks, had transformed into Oakhaven's most treasured possession, a living lullaby that gently coaxed slumber from even the most stubborn insomniacs. The village's reputation for deep, restorative sleep spread far and wide, drawing curious travelers and merchants who, after a night spent on the slope overlooking Balthazar's shack, would awaken surprisingly refreshed and depart with tales of the miracle of the sleeping village. The horses and cattle of Oakhaven were renowned for their placid temperament and robust health, a testament to their deep, undisturbed slumber, a stark contrast to the once frayed nerves of the abbey's own beasts before Balthazar's brief, stable-bound sojourn. As years gave way to decades, these whispers of Oakhaven's unusual tranquility and the peculiar blessing of its humming monk eventually drifted beyond the confines of the local valley, reaching the ears of a new generation of church scholars and inquisitors. The church, ever vigilant in its discernment of miracles and its condemnation of heresies, found itself presented with an unusual dilemma: the original judgment against Balthazar, though unofficial in its declaration of heresy of disturbed peace, had been accepted locally due to the sheer undeniable suffering of the St. Alcuin monks. But now, conflicting reports, persistent and numerous, spoke of a man whose involuntary act of sleep brought profound peace and physical restoration to an entire village. The catalyst for the re-examination came in the form of a visiting cardinal. A keen-minded prelate named Cardinal Anselm, no relation to the twitching brother Anselm of St. Alcuin's, thankfully, whose diocese encompassed a remote valley. He had heard the tales of Oakhaven and, intrigued by the sheer oddity of the phenomenon, dispatched a series of cautious, discreet envoys. These envoys, usually cloistered academics, spent nights among the villagers experiencing the hum for themselves. Their reports, initially skeptical, grew increasingly bewildered, speaking not of torment but of an inexplicable, soothing vibration that induced unparalleled slumber. Some even reported feeling a sense of deep, unexpected peace, quiet joy that they had rarely experienced in their austere academic lives. Upon receiving these unprecedented reports, Cardinal Anselm, a man more inclined to intellectual curiosity than immediate condemnation, decided to convene a special informal synod. It was to be held not in the grand halls of a city cathedral, but in the chapter room of discernment at the Abbey of St. Alcuin, the very place where Balthazar's fate had been sealed years ago. The new abbot, the former prior Relic, now a venerable but still rigidly unyielding figure, presided with an air of grim resignation. Brother Gregory, now very old, his eyes dim but his memory sharp, was present, his ancient chronicles spread before him, ready to provide the official and unofficial account of the monk who snored. The debate began, resurrecting the very arguments that had once tormented the abbey, but now seen through a new, deeply ironic lens. Venerable Abbott, brothers, began a young, earnest scholar-monk, Brother Thaddeus, who had served as an envoy to Oakhaven, his voice clear and resonant. We have witnessed with our own ears and felt with our own bodies the profound effect of Brother Balthazar's slumber upon the villagers of Oakhaven. They call it a miracle. They speak of an end to restless nights, of a vitality previously unknown. The animals, too, are renowned for their peace. How can such a pervasive bringer of peace be considered a source of spiritual corruption? Surely the Lord works in mysterious ways, and perhaps this unusual, resonant emanation is but another form of divine grace, a comfort for the weary, a lullaby from God himself, delivered in a most humble and unexpected vessel. He leaned forward, his eyes alight with conviction. Abbot Alaric, his face a granite mask of disapproval, cleared his throat. Brother Thaddeus, you speak with the fervor of youth, untempered by the prolonged suffering we endured within these very walls. We recall a time when this divine graces shook crucifixes from altars, caused candles to dance as if possessed, and filled the minds of God-fearing monks with phantom blasphemous chants. Is this the Lord's work? To sow such terror and confusion among his dedicated servants? We declared it a heresy of disturbed peace for good reason. It fundamentally undermined our sacred duty to cultivate silence for contemplation. The peace it brings to the unburdened villagers, to the simple beasts, is a perversion, a trick. It appeals to the flesh, not the spirit. True holiness, brother, does not manifest as a physical earthquake. Brother Gregory, his voice surprisingly strong despite his age, spoke up, referring to his chronicles. Abbott, if I may, I recorded the testimonies of Brother Thomas, who heard lamentations, and Brother Anselm, who heard grinding. But I also recorded Brother Bartholomew's observation of a melodic undercurrent, a structured drone, and my own testimony, Abbott, of the Latin chants, Pax vobiscum, sed non hic, peace be with you, but not here. Perhaps then, it was indeed peace, but a peace we, in our exhaustion and rigid interpretations, were unable to receive. Perhaps the "not here" was a commentary on our own spiritual inflexibility, not a condemnation of Balthazar himself. He looked pointedly at Abbot Alaric, a glint of old fire in his ancient eyes. A ripple of murmurs passed through the synod. The idea that their own suffering was a failure of perception rather than a divine test was a bitter pill for many. Another scholar, a Dominican known for his logical prowess, offered a nuanced view. If we consider the nature of peace, Venerable Abbot, it is often found in humble, unexpected places. The silence we cultivate in monasteries is an active silence, a suppression of worldly noise to hear God. But perhaps God also offers a passive peace, a foundational hum that stills the internal clamor, especially for those in the world who cannot achieve our rigorous discipline. Brother Balthazar, in his utter innocence, did not seek to produce this effect. He was merely an instrument. Could his physical gift be a form of unintentional charisma, a somatic blessing that emanates without intent, much like the warmth from a saint's presence, or the subtle scent of roses that sometimes accompanies divine grace? Abbot Alaric scoffed. A somatic blessing that made our teeth chatter and our candles dance. I have known saints whose very presence brought calm, but never one whose snoring brought physical tremors. This is novelty for novelty's sake, an attempt to twist the sacred to fit the absurd. The physical manifestation was disruptive, therefore it was unholy. But the disruption was here in our rigid stone abbey, and to our specific learned minds, countered Brother Thaddeus. In Oak Haven, a village of common folk, it is received as a blessing. Are we to say that God's grace only operates according to our precise liturgical expectations? Perhaps his peace is more encompassing, more universally applicable, even to the animals, than we previously allowed. The physician, Master Elias, spoke of physics, of vibrations. Perhaps those vibrations in a different context are indeed beneficial, a form of natural harmony. He dared to mention the burned physician's report, a sacrilege in itself just years ago. The debate raged for hours, cycling through theological interpretations, personal anecdotes, and philosophical musings on the nature of noise, silence, and sanctity. The heresies of gluttony and sloth were revisited and countered by arguments for Balthazar's obvious asceticism in his waking life. The idea of an unwitting conduit for malevolence was fiercely debated against the concept of an unwitting conduit for divine comfort. The very words spoken in the chapter room of discernment, once heavy with the weight of immediate suffering, now resonated with a strange academic detachment, punctuated by the occasional yawn from a monk too old to truly care about the finer points of snoring theology. Brother Gregory, listening intently, his ancient eyes observing the fierce earnestness of the young scholars, and the rigid obstinacy of his abbot, felt a profound, bittersweet irony. The abbey had cast out Balthazar for the very thing that now brought succor to a wider world. Their suffering had led to condemnation, while the suffering of others had led to salvation. The heresy they had concocted had become, for an entire village, a miracle. As the day wore on, Cardinal Anselm, having listened patiently, finally rose. His presence commanded attention. "Venerable Abbott, brothers," he began, his voice calm but authoritative. "The case of Brother Balthazar, or simply Balthazar as he is now known, is indeed singular in the annals of our Church. It forces us to confront the limitations of our understanding, and perhaps the rigidity of our definitions. While the suffering of the monks of St. Alcuin, as meticulously recorded by Brother Gregory, is beyond doubt, and the disruption experienced profound, we cannot ignore the consistent, widespread, and undeniably beneficial effects of Balthazar's nightly repose on the community of Oakhaven. It is a paradox." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "The Church has always held that intent matters, and Balthazar, by all accounts, remains a soul of profound innocence and unwavering piety. Furthermore, the Lord often chooses the humble and the unexpected as his instruments. While we may not understand the precise physics or the exact theological mechanism by which this Snore operates, we cannot deny its manifest fruits in Oakhaven. Peace, solace, and rejuvenation are gifts from God, regardless of the vessel through which they arrive." Cardinal Anselm cleared his throat. "Therefore, while we cannot at this moment fully understand or categorize this phenomenon in traditional terms, I propose that the initial informal declaration of heresy of disturbed peace against Brother Balthazar be formally rescinded." It was a judgment born of understandable duress, but one that perhaps failed to grasp the wider, more mysterious workings of divine grace. We shall not declare him a saint at this juncture, for the path to canonization is long and demands greater scrutiny and traditionally understood miracles. However, neither shall he be condemned. Let the chronicles record that Brother Balthazar, in his peculiar manifestation, was a man whose very being became a source of profound, albeit unconventional, peace. Let the silence of St. Alcuin's coexist with the deep resonant hum of Oakhaven, a testament to the fact that God's grace, and indeed his peace, can manifest in forms beyond our most rigid comprehension. Abbot Alaric's face remained impassive, though a subtle tightening around his lips betrayed his deep displeasure. The re-examination had not resulted in a full canonization, but neither had it reaffirmed his grim judgment. Brother Balthazar remained in a theological limbo, neither saint nor heretic, but a living, breathing paradox. Brother Gregory, however, felt a strange lightness in his heart. The blank page in his chronicle, reserved for Balthazar's final entry, now seemed to hold the promise of a nuanced, complex truth, far more interesting than a simple condemnation. The Abbey of St. Alcuin would remain in its quietude, but the memory of the monk who snored, no longer a source of terror, would forever be tinged with the strange, perplexing melody of a miraculous, earth-shaking lullaby. Chapter 11. The relic of Resonant Sinuses years, like the soft, persistent drip of melting icicles, continued their steady descent into the long, silent reservoir of history since Cardinal Anselm, with a weary but decisive gesture, had absolved Brother Balthazar from the dubious charge of heresy of disturbed peace. The Abbey of St. Alcuin, now under the unyielding stewardship of Abbot Alaric, remained a bastion of profound, almost sterile quietude, its stones echoing only with the measured cadence of monastic life. The monks, long since recovered from their sleep-deprived torments, moved through their days with a serene efficiency, though a subtle, almost imperceptible air of philosophical resignation clung to them. Their peace had come at a cost, a peace bought by the expulsion of a man whose unintended gift had now found a strange, celebrated purpose beyond their walls. Brother Gregory, the ancient chronicler, continued to fill his ledgers with meticulous script, his hand grown frail, but his mind still sharp enough to ponder the enduring paradox of Brother Balthazar. A figure who remained neither wholly saint nor entirely condemned, a perpetual question mark in the annals of St. Alcuin's. At the edge of the valley, in the small and unassuming village of Oakhaven, Brother Balthazar, now simply known as Balthazar the Humming Man, lived out his days in quiet contentment. His humble shepherd's shack, once a symbol of exile, had become a beloved sanctuary. He continued his gentle tending of the village's few sheep and goats, his plump hands as careful with a lamb as they once were with an illuminated manuscript. The villagers, free from the theological complexities that plagued the abbey, embraced Balthazar's unique nocturnal symphony with an uncomplicated joy. Each night, as the sun dipped below the ancient hills, they would gather on the gentle slope overlooking his shack, laying out their blankets, their children nestled beside them, and surrender themselves to the profound, resonant thrum that emanated from his peaceful slumber. The sound, that great pervasive vibration which had driven the monks to the brink of madness, was Oakhaven's lullaby, a deep, unwavering bass note that silenced the clamor of their anxieties and coaxed them into the deepest, most restorative sleep they had ever known. The village flourished under this unexpected blessing. Its folk were remarkably hale, their complexions clear, their tempers placid. The children, well rested, possessed an almost boundless energy, and even the livestock, lulled by the constant soothing vibration, yielded milk and wool with an unprecedented abundance. Years flowed into decades, and Balthazar, his gentle smile still a fixture, his eyes as guileless as ever, lived a life of quiet purpose and beloved eccentricity. He never fully understood the profound impact of his nightly exhalations, nor the complex debates that had raged over his very being. He was simply a man who slept deeply, and whose sleep somehow made others feel rested. One cold, crisp morning, after a night that had brought unparalleled peace to Oakhaven, Balthazar did not awaken. He lay on his straw pallet, a faint, serene smile on his lips, his breathing now utterly silent, his robust chest still. He had passed peacefully in his sleep, his last breath a whisper that left no resonant thrum behind. The initial days in Oakhaven were shrouded in a profound, unsettling quiet. The villagers mourned not only the passing of a kind, gentle soul, but also the abrupt cessation of their nightly comfort. That first night after Balthazar's passing, the usual village anxieties returned with a vengeance. The river gurgled too loudly, the wind whistled with an unfamiliar keen, and the subtle creaks of their homes felt jarringly amplified. Sleeplessness, the old, unwelcome companion, crept back into their beds, its insidious tendrils weaving through their minds. The villagers tossed and turned, their bodies aching for the familiar, soothing vibration that was now irrevocably gone. The miller, Thomas, found himself counting the revolutions of his millstones in the darkness once more, his mind a frantic, untamed whirl. Agnes, the weaver, listened to the frantic beat of her own heart, each thump a cruel reminder of the absent lullaby. Desperation, however, often breeds ingenuity, particularly in communities accustomed to relying on their own resourcefulness. As the days of restless nights stretched into a week, the villagers of Oakhaven, guided by an intuition born of their unique experience, began to recall the long-forgotten words of Master Elias, the pragmatic physician from Rouen. They remembered his dispassionate explanation of obstructed airways and vibrating palates, of a purely mechanical phenomenon. To the abbey monks, these words had been dismissed as blasphemy, a demonic trick. But to the Oakhaven villagers, unburdened by rigid theology, they now held a strange, practical truth. It was his e-body, they reasoned, that had produced the sound, not his spirit. And if it was his body, then perhaps a part of it, the very part that had hummed and resonated with such power, might still retain some of that soothing property. It was old man Hemlock, the wizened shepherd, who voiced the daring idea. The physician spoke of his throat, his nose. It was the breath that carried the hum. Perhaps the very bones that shaped that great breath still hold its essence. His words, shocking in their candor, were met with a stunned silence. Then a cautious, dawning understanding. It was unconventional, certainly, perhaps even a little morbid, but the prospect of sleep, deep and dreamless, outweighed any squeamishness. A small delegation, including the miller Thomas and Agnes the weaver, approached the village priest, Father Bartholomew, a kindly but somewhat bewildered man who had witnessed the miraculous transformation of his sleepless flock. He, too, had felt the loss of the pervasive hum. Faced with the unwavering conviction of his congregation, and having himself benefited greatly from Balthazar's gift, he reluctantly, after much agonizing prayer and consultation, with a slightly less rigid canon lawyer from a distant town, granted permission for a discreet exhumation. It was a decision that would send tremors through the ecclesiastical establishment, though none yet knew it. Under the shroud of a moonless night, Balthazar's humble grave was carefully opened. It was a solemn, hushed affair, conducted not with the ghoulish curiosity of grave robbers, but with the reverence of those seeking a blessing. The villagers, guided by their desperate need and the faint memory of Master Elias's anatomical sketches, sought the very source of the sound. With delicate, almost surgical precision, for the miller had a steady hand and the weaver an eye for intricate detail, Balthazar's nasal bones were carefully, respectfully removed. They were surprisingly robust, a testament perhaps to the sheer volume of air they had channeled. They were cleaned with blessed water and then, with profound veneration, placed within a small, intricately carved wooden reliquary, fashioned by the village carpenter from a piece of ancient oak. It was not a formal church-sanctioned relic, but for the villagers of Oakhaven, it was sacred nonetheless. The Relic of Resonant Sinuses, as it became known in Oakhaven, was installed not on an altar, but in a small consecrated alcove, within the old shepherd's shack, the very place where Balthazar lived and breathed his extraordinary gift. That night, as the first insomniacs gathered on the slope, a hush fell over them. The shack was silent, Balthazar gone. But then, Old Man Hemlock, the first to approach the reliquary, placed his gnarled hand upon the oak casing. He closed his eyes, concentrating, and claimed he felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, a ghost of the great hum. He placed his ear to the wood, and swore he heard a tiny internal thrumming, a resonance that echoed deep within his bones. He settled down, and within minutes was fast asleep, his snores a soft, contented counterpoint to the quiet night. The news spread, not with the dramatic flair of a grand miracle, but with the quiet, undeniable efficacy of its effect. Pilgrims, initially only from Oakhaven, then from neighboring hamlets and distant towns, began to arrive. They were not seeking spiritual enlightenment or the healing of grievous wounds, but the simple, profound blessing of sleep. They came, weary and hollow-eyed, suffering from the relentless torment of insomnia, from nervous conditions that stole their rest, from aches and pains that kept them tossing in their beds. They would sit or lie near the shack, some clutching a hand to the wooden reliquary, others simply breathing in the quiet air that now seemed to possess a lingering echo of Balthazar's calming presence. And one by one they would fall asleep, not with the immediate, overwhelming force of Balthazar's living snore, but with a gentle, persistent coaxing, a subtle soothing that seemed to emanate from the relic itself, a profound, almost hypnotic resonance. The relic of resonant sinuses became a phenomenon unique in the annals of the Church. It was not a relic of a martyred saint, nor of a ascetic who performed grand wonders. It was a relic of the mundane, of the physical, of an anatomical anomaly, yet it produced a tangible, undeniable benefit that defied conventional understanding. Its power was not to inspire awe, but to induce a profound, unpretentious calm. It worked, perhaps through suggestion, through the deep human need for rest, or perhaps, as Master Elias had once speculated, through the residual echoes of a unique physical resonance, a micro-vibration that continued to emanate from the remarkably structured bones, a lingering sympathetic hum that coaxed the restless nervous system into quietude. Reports of this peculiar pilgrimage eventually reached Abbott Alaric at St. Alcuin's. He received them with a mixture of grim satisfaction and profound theological discomfort. "They seek solace from a piece of bone," he thundered, slamming his fist on his oak table. "They place their faith in a cadaverous fragment, not in the grace of God. It is superstition. It is a perversion. It is further proof of the insidious nature of Balthazar's influence, that even in death, his very remains continue to subtly corrupt the minds of the simple-minded, drawing them to base physical comforts rather than the rigors of spiritual discipline. Yet even he could not deny the steady stream of tired, hopeful faces making their way towards Oakhaven, nor the occasional merchant who, having visited the Relic, spoke with newfound clarity and energy of the journeys ahead. The irony gnawed at his rigid soul. Brother Gregory, however, now frail and his eyesight failing, found a quiet sense of vindication. The blank page in his chronicle, reserved for Balthazar's final entry, was at last filled. He meticulously recorded the details of the relic of resonant Sinuses, the pilgrims, the restored sleep, and the continued, albeit grudging, acceptance of Oakhaven's unique blessing. He did not overtly contradict Abbott Alaric's condemnations, but his account, laden with the subtle irony of lived experience, quietly suggested a different truth. Balthazar, the heretic of disturbed peace, had become, in death, the unlikely, unofficial patron saint of the sleepless. His peculiar nasal bones, a testament to the fact that divine grace, and indeed profound human comfort, could be found in the most unexpected, the most mundane, and often the most absurd of places. The great, resonant snore that had once tormented an abbey now, through a piece of bone, continued to whisper a comforting lullaby to a weary world, a lasting monument to a monk whose peaceful slumber had defied all definitions of sanctity and sin. Chapter 12. The hymns of the snoring saint centuries, like the patient erosion of a riverbed, had carved their indelible marks upon the landscape, transforming the world beyond the valley of St. Alcuin's. The abbey itself, preserved by its remote location and the enduring adherence to its ancient rule, remained largely unchanged, a stoic monument to a bygone era. Abbot Alaric, the stern champion of silence, had long since joined Father Abbot Ignatius in the great silence, his rigid spirit at last finding its ultimate rest. His successors, though less fervent in their condemnation of Brother Balthazar, nonetheless maintained the abbé's hard-won quietude, perpetuating the narrative of the heresy of disturbed peace as a cautionary tale against spiritual laxity and worldly indulgence. The meticulous chronicles of Brother Gregory, the very old chronicler, had, in their later editions, become revered texts, though the entries concerning Brother Balthazar were often glossed over, or interpreted with a cautious, almost embarrassed ambiguity by generations of monastic scholars. The abbé's monks slept soundly, their nights undisturbed by tremors or phantom chants, but a certain dry, unyielding air permeated their days, a testament to a peace that felt more like an absence than a presence. Yet, outside the abbey walls, the legend of Balthazar, the humming man, had blossomed, nurtured by the continuous, unbroken peace of Oakhaven. The village, now far more prosperous and lively than its meager beginnings, had become an unlikely haven for the perennially restless. Its reputation for profound, restorative sleep drew travelers from distant lands, merchants, scholars, and gentry alike, all seeking the elusive balm that Balthazar's nightly symphony, even in his absence, continued to provide. The relic of resonant Sinuses, Balthazar's carefully preserved nasal bones, housed in the humble shepherd's shack, had become a quiet, unofficial pilgrimage site, It was visited not by those seeking grand miracles or divine visions, but by the weary, the anxious, the chronically sleepless, all of whom found solace in its subtle, lingering resonance. The small, almost imperceptible vibration that emanated from the oak reliquary was said to settle the mind, to quiet the internal clamor, and to guide the most troubled souls into the deep, dreamless embrace of slumber. Stories of its efficacy were exchanged in hushed, reverent tones, a testament to a practical, unassuming miracle that defied grand theological pronouncements. As the wheel of time turned, and the very fabric of knowledge began to shift from purely spiritual interpretations to more empirical observation, the enduring paradox of Balthazar attracted a new kind of attention. In nascent academies and burgeoning intellectual circles, where the dissection of a cadaver was beginning to be seen as a pathway to understanding God's intricate design, and where natural philosophy tentatively began to assert itself alongside theology, Brother Gregory's comprehensive chronicles of St. Alcuin's were rediscovered. His meticulous, if sometimes bewildered, accounts of Balthazar's nightly phenomenon, and the wildly divergent perceptions of it, offered a unique case study. Shoeless, unburdened by the immediate trauma of sleep deprivation or the rigid doctrines of medieval monasticism, approached the accounts with a detached, yet profound, intellectual curiosity. They were not seeking to condemn or canonize, but to understand. Among these emerging scholars was a particularly astute polymath from a burgeoning university town, a man named Master Alistair Finch. He was a pioneer in what he termed acoustic philosophy, a nascent field that sought to understand the nature of sound, its propagation, and its effect on the human body and mind. Master Finch, a man of meticulous habits and a surprisingly robust constitution that rendered him immune to common sleeplessness, found Brother Gregory's fragmented descriptions of Balthazar's snoring to be utterly compelling. He acquired a painstakingly copied manuscript of Gregory's Chronicle, and poring over its brittle pages began his ambitious quest to reconstruct, as accurately as possible, the hypothetical sound of Brother Balthazar's earth-shaking snore. Master Finch began by categorizing the myriad descriptions. The objective physical effects shook crucifixes, candles danced, ground trembled, air vibrated, and the subjective auditory perceptions, guttural roar, grinding, lamentations of lost souls, melodic, content structured drone, Latin chuck. He noted the stark contrast between the monk's terror-induced hallucinations and the villagers' soothing experiences. He pored over the anatomical sketches left behind by the almost forgotten Master Elias of Rouen, marveling at the discarded physician's prescience. Elias' mechanical phenomenon now seemed remarkably insightful, a quiet truth lost amidst a storm of spiritual fear. Finch theorized that Balthazar's unique anatomy, a combination of a robust soft palate, thick nasal passages, and perhaps an unusual cranial structure, created a truly exceptional acoustic phenomenon. He hypothesized that the primary sound would have been a deep, pervasive, low-frequency vibration, almost infrasonic, below the range of conscious hearing for some, but capable of transmitting through bone and stone, causing the physical tremors the monks describe. This deep fundamental tone, he deduced, would then have been overlaid with a complex array of higher frequency harmonics and overtones, produced by the specific configuration of Balthazar's airways and the resonant chambers of his head and chest. It was these harmonics, Finch believed, that gave the snore its multifaceted, almost chameleon-like quality, allowing different listeners, particularly those in states of extreme exhaustion or heightened anxiety, to interpret it in wildly divergent ways. Using his rudimentary knowledge of acoustics and the dimensions of the Abbey of St. Alcuin, which he meticulously measured during a clandestine visit, much to the consternation of Abbott Alaric's successors, Master Finch began to construct a theoretical model. He experimented with resonant chambers, hollowed logs, stretched animal skins, taut strings, attempting to mimic the kinds of frequencies and overtones that Balthazar's body might have generated. His workshop became a strange, echoing space, filled with low hums, resonant thrums, and the occasional, surprisingly loud, guttural groan from his contraptions. The most perplexing aspect, the Latin chants, required a leap of multidisciplinary insight. Finch consulted linguists and musicians. He proposed that certain harmonic patterns within Balthazar's snore, perhaps the rhythmic pulsing of his deepest breaths, might have inadvertently mimicked the cadences and melodic contours of Gregorian chant. The human brain, in its desperate search for meaning, especially when sleep-deprived and steeped in religious context, would then fill in the blanks, transforming abstract sound patterns into recognizable, though fragmented and distorted, words, particularly those most deeply embedded in the monks' daily lives, like the Ides Irae or the Yecre Eleison. The phrase Pax Vobiscum, sed non hic peace be with you, but not here Brother Gregory's chilling memory, was theorized to be a supreme example of auditory pareidolia, where the mind projects meaning onto random stimuli, a cruel irony born of their collective suffering. Conversely, for the villagers of Oak Haven, unburdened by such rigid theological frameworks and desperate for repose, the deep, pervasive, low-frequency component of Balthazar's snore likely acted as a form of white noise or brown noise. This constant, non-threatening hum would have effectively masked the smaller, more jarring sounds of the night, the gurgling river, the whistling wind, the creaking timbers, and, more importantly, quieted the internal chatter of their restless minds. The physical vibrations, rather than alarming, would have been perceived as a comforting, almost maternal resonance, a profound somatic lullaby that settled their nervous systems into a state conducive to sleep. The animals, similarly unencumbered by complex thought, would have perceived it purely as a soothing environmental constant, triggering a primitive relaxation response. After years of dedicated study, Master Finch published his groundbreaking treatise on the somatic resonances of Brother Balthazar and the subjectivity of perceived sound. In it, he presented his theoretical reconstruction of Balthazar's snore, a complex auditory profile that he called the hymns of the snoring saint. It wasn't a melodious hymn in the traditional sense, but rather a profoundly resonant, multi-layered soundscape, a foundational, bone-rattling, low-frequency thrum, overlaid with a rich tapestry of higher harmonics that under certain conditions and with certain predispositions could be interpreted as everything from bestial roars to human laments, and even, most ironically, fragmented Latin chants. He argued that Balthazar was neither saint nor heretic in the conventional sense, but a man of extraordinary, albeit unwitting, acoustic power, whose unique physiology and the ambient conditions created a phenomenon that was both physically disruptive and psychologically transformative. His work, initially met with skepticism by the Church, Abbott Alaric's distant successors considered it dangerously secular, eventually gained traction among a new generation of more open-minded scholars. The hymns of the snoring saint became a fascinating case study, a bridge between the physical and the perceived, the mundane and the miraculous. It offered a lens through which to understand not just Balthazar, but the powerful influence of sound on the human experience, and the often absurd ways in which fear, exhaustion, and belief could shape perception. Brother Gregory's final poignant entry in his chronicle, penned with a trembling hand, had ultimately captured this complex truth. He was cast out for disturbing our peace. He brought peace to others. His sound was our torment and their balm. Perhaps God's grace is louder and stranger than we, in our quiet studies, ever dared to imagine. The Abbey of St. Alcuin, though it remained steeped in its profound silence, would forever be linked to the paradox of Brother Balthazar, the accidental heretic and unwitting saint, whose earth-shaking snore, centuries later, continued to resonate not as a curse, but as a complex, ironic, and strangely comforting symphony, a testament to the enduring mysteries of human existence and the peculiar places where peace can truly be found. Chapter 13. The order of somnolent brethren centuries continued their relentless march, carving new landscapes from old, replacing the whisper of parchment with the insistent hum of burgeoning industry, and the flickering candlelight of Saint Light. Alcuins with the stark electric glare of progress. The abbey itself, remarkably, persisted, a quiet anachronism nestled in its secluded valley. Its stones, now truly ancient, harbored generations of monks who, while respecting the chronicles of Brother Gregory, often regarded the tale of Brother Balthazar as a quaint, if somewhat embarrassing, historical anomaly. Abbott Alaric's rigid successors had long ensured that silence remained the paramount virtue. A silence that felt less like peace and more like a carefully maintained vacuum, devoid of the complex, resonant presence that Balthazar had once, however unwittingly, embodied. The abbey slept soundly indeed, but it often felt as if it slept with its eyes wide open, perpetually vigilant against any disturbance, a subtle tension clinging to its hallowed halls like morning mist. Meanwhile, the village of Oakhaven, far from languishing in its traditional obscurity, had transformed. The relic of Resonant Sinuses, Balthazar's humble nasal bones housed in the old shepherd's shack, had quietly, organically, become a renowned center for relief from the modern affliction of sleeplessness. The gentle, subtle hum that still emanated from the reliquary, a residual echo of Balthazar's profound slumber, had proven uniquely efficacious against the cacophony of the New Age. People came from bustling cities, from noisy factories, from lives stretched thin by anxious thoughts and the relentless glare of artificial light. They came seeking not a grand miracle, but the simple, profound blessing of a night's rest. Oakhaven, once a sleepy hamlet, now hummed with the quiet industry of hospitality, its inns always full, its villagers paradoxically remaining the most well-rested people in the land. The scientific re-evaluation of Balthazar's Snore by scholars like Master Alistair Finch, with his hymns of the snoring saint, had lent a new, almost academic legitimacy to Oakhaven's unique phenomenon, bridging the gap between medieval belief and nascent understanding of sound and physiology. Balthazar, the accidental heretic, was slowly, quietly being re-evaluated, not by the rigid strictures of the church, but by the practical, undeniable need of a sleepless world. It was in this evolving world, centuries after Balthazar's passing, that the great restlessnesses truly took hold. The relentless pace of urban life, the pervasive glow of artificial illumination that blurred the boundaries of day and night, the constant hum of machines and carriages, and the subtle, gnawing anxieties of a rapidly changing society had plunged vast swaths of humanity into a perpetual state of wakefulness. Insomnia was no longer a personal failing or a rare affliction. It was a societal malady, a widespread epidemic that eroded health, frayed nerves, and dulled the very spirit. The common remedies, harsh opiates, potent sedatives, or desperate folk concoctions offered fleeting, often unpleasant, respite. The church, too, struggled. Traditional spiritual disciplines, while valuable, seemed insufficient against a problem born not of moral failing, but of a deeply ingrained physiological and environmental imbalance. Prayer vigils, once a source of comfort, often left supplicants more exhausted. It was against this backdrop of pervasive wakefulness that a singular figure emerged, a man whose quiet brilliance and profound empathy would forever alter the perception of Brother Balthazar's legacy. His name was Father Bede, a scholar of ancient texts and a former contemplative monk himself, the one who had always found the rigid silence of traditional cloisters less a conduit to God and more a source of restless introspection. Father Bede possessed a singular affliction, a chronic, debilitating insomnia that had plagued him since childhood, forcing him to spend countless nights in restless agony, listening to the very creak of the earth. He had exhausted every known remedy, every prayer, every meditative technique, and still sleep eluded him. His studies led him by chance to Brother Gregory's Chronicles, and then, inevitably, to the enduring legend of Oakhaven and the peculiar relic of Resonant Sinuses. Driven by a desperate hope that mingled with a scholar's rigorous curiosity, Father Bede made the pilgrimage to Oakhaven. He spent a week there, not in study, but in quiet observation, and then, finally, he sat on the slope overlooking the old shack, his body aching with sleeplessness, his mind a frantic, unceasing whirl. He reached out, hesitantly, and placed his hand on the weathered oak of the reliquary. He felt it a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to bypass his conscious anxiety and settle directly into the core of his being. It was not a thunderclap, nor a sermon, nor a miracle in the dramatic sense. It was simply a hum, a pervasive, gentle resonance that seemed to quiet the insistent clamor of his own nervous system. For the first time in memory, Father Bede slept. He slept deeply, profoundly, for 8 unbroken hours, waking not with a start, but with a gentle, almost reverent sigh. The experience changed him. It was not a conversion to a new faith, but a profound re-understanding of the old. He realized that peace was not always found in the absence of sound, but sometimes in the right kind of sound. That profound rest was not merely a physical necessity, but a spiritual gateway, a state of vulnerable openness where the soul could truly commune. And that Balthazar, the heretic of disturbed peace, had in his unwitting way tapped into a profound universal truth about human well-being. Father Bede returned from Oakhaven a changed man, no longer pursuing rigid academic studies, but consumed by a singular vision to establish a new monastic order, one dedicated to the ministry of rest and the cultivation of profound, restorative peace, drawing direct inspiration from the paradoxical legacy of Brother Balthazar. He called it the Order of Somnolent Brethren. The initial response from the established church was, predictably, a mixture of bewilderment and polite skepticism. Abbott Alaric's successors at St. Alcuin, upon hearing of Father Bede's proposals, scoffed, maintaining that such an order would only encourage sloth and indulgence. To found an order on the principle of sleep, one sniffed. It is an affront to the monastic ideal of constant vigilance and prayer. But Father Bede, undeterred, argued that true prayer, true contemplation, and true spiritual growth could not flourish in a mind and body ravaged by ceaseless wakefulness. He posited that profound rest was a prerequisite for deep spiritual insight, a form of active stillness that allowed the soul to be receptive to divine grace. He argued with gentle persistence that Balthazar's unintentional gift was a practical demonstration of God's desire for his children to find peace, even in their most vulnerable hours. He gathered a small, eclectic group of disillusioned scholars, weary contemplatives, and compassionate laymen, all of whom had suffered from the modern affliction of sleeplessness, or understood its profound toll. Together, they established their first modest priory in a secluded valley, not far from Oakhaven, but far enough from St. Alcuin's to avoid immediate conflict. Their rule was unlike any other. It was not based on rigorous silence, but on the cultivation of specific ambient sounds, on the subtle manipulation of environment to induce rest, and on the conscious practice of restorative slumber as a form of spiritual discipline. The Order of Somnolent Brethren specialized in several unique ministries. First, the chambers of resonant peace. These were carefully constructed cells, designed with particular acoustic properties to amplify certain low-frequency hums, mimicking the profound, pervasive vibration that Balthazar had produced. The monks of the order would enter these chambers, not to sleep, for their own rest was paramount, but to generate a controlled soothing drone using deep, guttural chanting techniques, often involving the deliberate resonation of their own chest cavities and nasal passages. These living lullabies were not intended to be heard as distinct words or melodies, but as a foundational, almost infrasonic thrum that permeated the very stone, gently coaxing visitors into a state of profound relaxation. The chambers were open to weary pilgrims, to those suffering from chronic sleeplessness, and to those seeking a deeper form of meditative rest. People would lie on simple pallets, and the monks, with remarkable discipline, would maintain their soothing drone for hours, their voices blending into a single, continuous hum that seemed to vibrate the very air, settling the restless minds of their guests. Second, they engaged in dream divination and interpretation, believing that the mind, when truly at rest, was more open to divine communication. The somnolent brethren meticulously recorded the dreams of those who found peace in their chambers. They held that lucid, profound dreams, rather than being mere phantoms of the mind, could offer insights into spiritual maladies, unresolved anxieties, or even premonitions. Their interpretations were not dogmatic, but compassionate, seeking to guide individuals towards inner harmony rather than condemning them. Third, they focused on pastoral hypnose, a gentle ministry to the dying, the traumatized, and the deeply anxious, recognizing that the end of life, or periods of intense suffering, often brought profound restlessness and fear. The monks would sit by the bedsides of the afflicted, performing their low, soothing hums, offering a comforting presence and a gentle pathway to peaceful slumber, easing the transition of body and mind. They believed that a peaceful death, or moment of profound rest in the midst of suffering, was a sacred act of grace, a final act of letting go into God's embrace. Their rule, far from the ascetic rigor of St. Alcuin's, emphasized cycles of profound rest and gentle activity. They understood that their unique ministry demanded that they themselves be well rested, their bodies and minds finely tuned instruments of peace. Their prayers were often whispered or internal, but always grounded in a deep understanding of the body's need for repose as a pathway to the soul's nourishment. They studied not only ancient theological texts, but also the emerging philosophies of the body, the nature of sound, and the subtle interplay between physical well-being and spiritual health. They even incorporated some of Master Elias's original, discarded anatomical sketches into their pedagogical materials, viewing them not as blasphemy, but as insightful observations of God's intricate design. The Abbey of St. Alcuin, by contrast, remained aloof, viewing the somnolent brethren with a mixture of quiet disdain and grudging curiosity. Abbott Alaric's successors often found themselves grappling with the growing popular appeal of the new order. Pilgrims still came to St. Alcuin's, but fewer for contemplation, and more as a stopover on their way to Oakhaven or the new priory of the somnolent brethren. The irony was palpable. The order, founded on the rejection of Balthazar, now found itself overshadowed by his peculiar posthumous legacy. Now an elder himself would occasionally make the pilgrimage to Oakhaven, sitting by the relic of Resonant Sinuses, listening to its faint, lingering hum. He often reflected on the profound paradox of Balthazar, a man declared a heretic for a sound that brought torment, yet whose very being in life and in death ultimately became the foundation of a new ministry, dedicated to profound, restorative peace. The world, he mused, was rarely as simple as theological pronouncements made it out to be. God's grace, like Balthazar's snore, could be loud, strange, and deeply unsettling to some, yet a profound, resonant lullaby to others. The Order of Somnolent Brethren stood as a testament to this truth, a quiet revolution born from an ancient snore, offering a unique path to peace in a restless world, proving that sometimes The most profound forms of sanctity are found not in arduous striving, but in the gentle, resonant embrace of deep, unburdened sleep. Chapter 14. The Science Behind the Snore. The tapestry of time continued to unravel, thread by thread, replacing the rough-spun fabric of the medieval world with the increasingly intricate weave of modernity. The Abbey of St. Alcuin, though still a bastion of ancient custom and hallowed silence, had receded further into the mists of history, its once dominant influence now confined to the occasional scholarly visit or the quiet awe of tourists. Abbott Alaric's successors, a long line of men dedicated to the rigid quietude he so prized, had maintained the abbey's tranquil, almost brittle, atmosphere. The chronicles of Brother Gregory, once guarded jealously, had over centuries been meticulously copied, annotated, and eventually published, finding their way into the hands of scholars far removed from the cold stone and sleepless nights of St. Alcuin's. And among these scholars, a particular fascination grew around the paradoxical figure of Brother Balthazar, the monk whose earth-shaking snore had inadvertently founded a ministry of rest. The order of Somnolent Brethren, initially viewed with suspicion by the conservative elements of the Church, had over generations blossomed into a respected, even revered, institution. Their priories, strategically located near bustling urban centers or serene natural retreats, offered their unique chambers of resonant peace, where the monks, through their cultivated low-frequency hums, guided the perpetually exhausted populace into profound, restorative slumber. The relic of Resonant Sinuses in Oakhaven, while never formally canonized, remained a quietly effective pilgrimage site, a testament to the enduring power of Balthazar's peculiar gift. The world, increasingly overwhelmed by noise, anxiety, and the relentless demands on human consciousness, yearned for the very peace that Balthazar had once, however innocently, disturbed. It was into this era of burgeoning scientific inquiry and a renewed interest in the human body that Dr. Evelyn Thorne emerged. She was not a theologian, nor a contemplative, but a forensic historian specializing in medieval medicine and the often baffling intersection of physical ailment and spiritual interpretation. Her particular fascination lay in the obscure, the misdiagnosed, the phenomena that baffled ancient minds and were consequently imbued with supernatural significance. Dr. Thorne possessed a mind as sharp as a newly honed scalpel, and an insatiable curiosity that led her to delve into dusty archives, decipher obscure Latin texts, and piece together the fragments of forgotten understanding. The case of Brother Balthazar, a man declared a heretic of disturbed peace for an anatomical function, was to her a goldmine, a perfect illustration of how the prevailing scientific and philosophical paradigms of an era shaped the very perception of reality. Dr. Thorne's research began with a meticulous examination of Brother Gregory's chronicles. She read, with a detached yet empathetic eye, the harrowing accounts of the St. Alcuin monks, the shaking candles, the fallen crucifix, the phantom Latin chants of Pax Vobiscum, sed non hic. She noted the increasing desperation, the escalating spiritual interpretations, and the eventual agonizing decision to exile Balthazar. She then turned her attention to the scattered, often contradictory, medieval medical texts of the period. Medieval medical knowledge, Dr. Thorne knew, was primarily rooted in the ancient Greek humoral theory, positing that the human body was governed by four fundamental humors: blood, sanguine, yellow bile; choleric, black bile; melancholic, and phlegmatic. Health was a state of perfect balance between these humors, while illness resulted from their imbalance, excess, or deficiency. Sleep, according to these texts, was a crucial process for the body to assimilate its food and restore its natural warmth. Often associated with the digestion of vapors and the settling of humors, Dr. Thorne found numerous references to breathing difficulties and what was loosely termed heavy sleeping. Physicians of the era often linked such conditions to an excess of phlegm, a cold and moist humor believed to accumulate in the head and chest. A thick, viscous phlegm, it was theorized, could obstruct the passages, causing gurgling, rattling, and laborious breathing during sleep. Some texts described how this phlegm could even lead to a suffocation in slumber, a concept not entirely dissimilar to modern sleep apnea, though their understanding of the underlying mechanism was vastly different. They would recommend drying agents, purges, bleedings, or hot, dry poultices to draw out the excess phlegm. D2 was crucial. Cold and moist foods were to be avoided. Dr. Thorne imagined the earnest, well-meaning physician whose Cellarer Benedict had summoned, trying to apply these theories to Balthazar. He would have observed Balthazar's somewhat robust build, perhaps attributing it to an excess of the phlegmatic's temperament. The loud, resonant snore would have been understood as the powerful involuntary expulsion of air through passages choked with a glutinous, obstructing phlegm. The recommended remedies: the boiled nettle and donkey's milk. The purges, the leeches, all aimed at ridding the body of this imagined excess phlegm, to dry and cleanse the internal passages. The absurdity, to Dr. Thorne's modern mind, was stark. They were treating a physiological issue, obstructive sleep apnea, a vibration of the soft tissues, as a humoral imbalance, a physical symptom of an internal dampness. She found records of medieval surgical attempts for breathing issues, usually rudimentary incisions into the throat or palate, born more of desperate experimentation than true anatomical understanding. Such procedures were rare, highly dangerous, and often fatal, and mercifully no one at St. Alcuin's had suggested such a drastic measure for Balthazar. The risk, they likely reasoned, far outweighed the potential benefit, especially given their inability to fully grasp the precise nature of his condition. But the medieval medical treatises, Dr. Thorne noted, quickly ran out of explanations for a phenomenon of Balthazar's sheer magnitude. They could explain a yell-out and snore, yes, but not one that shook an entire stone abbey. Their understanding of sound propagation was rudimentary. The idea of low-frequency vibrations traveling through solid structures and causing physical effects was beyond their grasp. When conventional medicine failed, the intellectual void was inevitably filled by spiritual interpretation. This was where the chronicles of Brother Gregory and the accounts of Prior Alaric became particularly illuminating for Dr. Thorne. The sheer, inexplicable physical force of Balthazar's snore, coupled with the inability of their best medical knowledge to explain it, naturally pushed the monks toward theological explanation. If it wasn't an imbalance of humors, and it clearly wasn't a matter of willful sin, Balthazar's piety was beyond doubt, then it had to be something supernatural. The Church, in its comprehensive worldview, provided ready-made frameworks, divine test, angelic influence, quickly dismissed given the disruptive nature, or, most compellingly, demonic activity. Dr. Thorne traced how the subjective experiences of the sleep-deprived monks, their minds frayed and susceptible to suggestion, further solidified these spiritual interpretations. Brother Thomas' Lamentations of Lost Souls, Brother Anselm's Grinding, and especially Brother Gregory's Latin chants, Pax vobiscum sed non hic, were to Dr. Thorne textbook examples of pareidolia and auditory hallucinations brought on by extreme exhaustion. The powerful, resonant, low-frequency hum, likely felt more than heard, would have been interpreted by each monk through the lens of his own fears and spiritual anxieties. The deep, guttural sounds could easily morph into bestial roars, while the rhythmic pulses might, for a mind steeped in liturgy, coalesce into fragmented, distorted chants. The psychological state of the monks, born of physical deprivation, directly influenced their perception of an otherwise purely physical phenomenon. Master Elias of Rouen, the pragmatic physician who had briefly graced St. Alcuin's, stood out in Dr. Thorne's research as a lone voice of prescience. His explanation of obstruction of the upper airway and vibrating soft palate was, Dr. Thorne realized, remarkably close to modern understanding of obstructive sleep apnea. His mention of mechanical phenomenon and physics was a nascent glimmer of the scientific method, attempting to penetrate the thick fog of medieval belief. That his accurate diagnosis was dismissed as blasphemy, and the devil's new guise was a tragic, yet perfectly logical, consequence of the prevailing intellectual climate. His understanding, though correct, simply had no place in a world that sought spiritual answers for physical enigmas. Dr. Thorne concluded that Balthazar's case was a microcosm of a much larger historical truth. The limitations of scientific understanding often compel humanity to seek explanations in the supernatural. Medieval medicine, while possessing a sophisticated theoretical framework for its time, lacked the anatomical and physiological knowledge and the diagnostic tools to comprehend something as complex as Balthazar's condition. The very precision of Master Elias's diagnosis made it alien and threatening to a worldview deeply ingrained with humoral theory and demonology. For the monks, Balthazar's snore was a theological problem because it resisted all other forms of explanation available to them. It challenged their understanding of piety, their experience of divine grace, and their very definition of monastic peace. In her own published work, The Snore That Shook a World, a forensic look at medieval sleep disorders and the case of Brother Balthazar, Dr. Thorne presented her findings with meticulous detail and a dry, understated wit. She argued that Balthazar's heresy of disturbed peace was not a mark against his soul, but a profound indictment of the limitations of medieval knowledge. His story was not one of good versus evil, but of sound versus perception, of physiology versus philosophy, and of how fear, born of ignorance, could transform the mundane into the monstrous. She highlighted the profound irony of the abbey's decision. They had banished a man for a physiological condition they could not comprehend, only for that very condition to become a source of comfort and healing when viewed through a different cultural lens. The villagers of Oakhaven, unburdened by medieval medical texts or theological anxieties, simply experienced the sound. For them, its low-frequency vibration resonated not with demonic intent, but with the primal comfort of a deep, steady hum, a natural lullaby. The order of Somnolent Brethren, centuries later, unwittingly confirmed Master Elias' initial insight and Oakhaven's folk wisdom, building a spiritual practice on the very physical principles that medieval theologians had dismissed as blasphemy. Dr. Thorne's work helped to finally pull Brother Balthazar from his theological limbo, offering a rational, albeit historically ironic, explanation for his extraordinary life. He was not a heretic nor a saint in the conventional sense, but a man whose unique anatomy and the prevailing worldview of his time collided in a spectacular, sleep-shattering fashion. His story became a vibrant thread in the larger tapestry of human understanding, a reminder that what we perceive as miraculous or demonic is often merely the unknown, waiting for the right lens through which to be understood. The Abbey of St. Alcuin, in its quiet corner of the world, continued its ancient rites, its silence still profound, but the ghost of a great resonant snore, once a terror, now seemed to whisper a complex, enduring truth about the science and the absurdity of sleep. Chapter 15. The Balthazar Paradox. The relentless turning of the grand cosmic wheel had continued for centuries, each revolution polishing the edges of history and softening the sharp contours of memory. The Abbey of St. Alcuin, though still a bastion of ancient observance, had become a quiet, almost forgotten corner of the world, its profound silence a relic in itself. Abbott Alaric's stern legacy had ensured generations of monks who adhered to a rigid, almost brittle quietude, a peace that often felt more like an absence than a presence, haunted by the very history they painstakingly preserved. Brother Gregory's meticulous chronicles, once controversial, had long since found their place in revered archives, though the entries concerning Brother Balthazar remained a source of quiet theological discomfort for the more conservative scholars within the order. Yet, outside the abbey walls, the paradox of Balthazar had not merely persisted, it had blossomed into a vibrant, multifaceted legacy. Oakhaven, no longer a humble village but a thriving town, had become a pilgrimage site for the perennially restless. Its reputation for profound sleep, drawing a steady stream of weary souls from every corner of the modern world. The relic of Resonant Sinuses, Balthazar's humble nasal bones, housed in the exquisitely restored shepherd's shack, was venerated not with the solemnity of traditional relics, but with a quiet, almost affectionate reverence by those who sought its peculiar, calming hum. Its subtle, lingering vibration continued to coax deep slumber from anxious minds, proving itself an unassuming yet undeniably effective instrument of peace in an increasingly overstimulated world. And the Order of Somnolent Brethren, founded by the visionary Father Bede, had flourished beyond all initial expectations. Their chambers of resonant peace, where monks generated controlled, low-frequency hums to soothe the afflicted, were a testament to the practical application of Balthazar's unwitting gift. They specialized in ministries of rest, dream interpretation, and pastoral care for the anxious and dying, offering a form of spiritual solace rooted in the profound necessity of human repose. Their philosophy, once deemed radical, had found resonance in a world grappling with pervasive sleeplessness, affirming that true spiritual insight often blossomed not from relentless vigilance but from the deep, nurturing embrace of undisturbed rest. Dr. Evelyn Thorne's Forensic History, The Snore That Shook a World, had provided the scientific armature for Balthazar's phenomenon, explaining the earth-shaking snore as a complex interplay of physiology and acoustics, and the varied perceptions of it as a function of psychological state and environmental context. This explanation, once heresy, was now foundational knowledge, demystifying the miracle without diminishing its profound impact. The stage was thus set, centuries after his quiet passing, for the final, enduring debate surrounding Brother Balthazar. The Balthazar Paradox. This was not a trial of guilt or innocence, nor a question of medical anomaly, but a profound philosophical and theological inquiry that transcended the simple categories of saint and heretic. It was debated in the hallowed halls of universities, in dimly lit philosophical salons, and in the burgeoning field of spiritual bioethics, a discipline seeking to reconcile the ancient mysteries of faith with the ever-unfolding truths of science. The core of the paradox was stark. Can a person, declared a heretic for actions entirely involuntary and purely biological in origin, be considered a saint for the beneficial outcomes of those very same biological actions? If his snoring was a natural physiological phenomenon, however extreme, what role did divine grace play? If it was simply physics, could it be holy? One prominent school of thought, championed by Professor Alistair Vance, a modern philosopher of religion, argued for a radical re-evaluation of sanctity. The traditional criteria for sainthood, he posited in his seminal work, say unintended incarnation, have long focused on conscious virtue, heroic acts of faith, and miraculous interventions defying natural law. But Balthazar compels us to consider a new category, the saint of somatic grace. His piety in waking life was exemplary, yes, but his true profound impact stemmed from an unconscious, involuntary physical gift. The peace he brought to Oakhaven, the healing he wrought for the sleepless, was not willed by him, but emanated from his very being, a profound resonant hum that acted as a balm. If God works through all things, through the subtle movements of the universe and the intricate designs of human anatomy, then why should his grace not manifest through a unique physiological trait? To limit God's instruments only to the consciously virtuous or the overtly miraculous is to limit God himself. Balthazar was a conduit, an unwitting vessel for a form of peace, a living prayer delivered not by word but by breath, by fundamental vibration. His heresy of disturbed peace was a profound misunderstanding of divine abundance, an inability of one rigid system to comprehend grace when it arrived in an unexpected, unliturgical package. Countering this, the Neo-Thomist theologians, still influenced by the long-standing tradition of St. Alcuin's, argued for the preservation of traditional distinctions. Father Benedictus, a severe but intellectually rigorous theologian, wrote in his critique, "The dangers of unwitting holiness. While we concede the beneficial effects of Balthazar's unique physiology, and we acknowledge the historical context of the abbey's initial judgment, to elevate such a figure to sainthood risks diluting the very meaning of holiness. Sanctity at its core involves conscious moral striving, intentional acts of charity, and a deliberate turning towards God. If a bodily function, no matter how beneficial, becomes grounds for veneration, where do we draw the line? Is every robust individual who inadvertently soothes those around them a potential saint? This reduces spiritual attainment to biological lottery, undermining the agency of free will and the deliberate cultivation of virtue. Balthazar's waking piety was commendable, but it was his sleep that became the focus, a state beyond moral intentionality. The peace he brought, though real, was a secondary effect, a natural consequence of sound waves in human perception, not a deliberate spiritual offering. It may be a blessed anomaly, but it is not sanctity in the traditional sense. It is a biological gift, a unique resonance, but not a spiritual triumph. Philosophers of language and perception also weighed in, adding further layers to the paradox. Dr. Elara Vance, no relation to Alistair Vance, though they often shared a panel, proposed the concept of contextual sanctity. The very same phenomenon, she lectured, the Balthazar snore, was perceived as a demonic torment in one context, St. Alcuin's, among sleep-deprived, fear-ridden monks operating within a rigid theological framework, and a divine blessing in another, Oakhaven, among desperate pragmatic villagers unburdened by dogma. This is not a contradiction of truth, but a revelation about the subjective nature of human experience and the powerful role of narrative and expectation. Was Balthazar a heretic? Yes, to the monks who suffered him. Was he a saint? Yes, to the villagers who found peace. His being was a mirror, reflecting the needs and interpretations of those who perceived him. The heresy and miracle were less about Balthazar's essence and more about the observer's minds. This forces us to question not just who is a saint, but how we, as humans, construct reality itself through our collective suffering and our collective longing for peace. The most enduring and perplexing aspect of the Balthazar paradox lay in the ultimate reconciliation of these viewpoints. There was no single universally accepted pronouncement. The Church, in its ancient wisdom and its ponderous pace, never formally canonized Brother Balthazar, nor did it fully retract its cautious skepticism. He remained in a peculiar limbo, a figure debated, admired, and occasionally whispered about with a knowing smile. Yet his legacy endured, fragmented, and reinterpreted. In the Abbey of St. Alcuin, the chronicle of Brother Gregory remained, a quiet reminder that even profound silence could be disrupted by the inexplicable, and that rigid dogma could sometimes blind one to an unconventional truth. His story became a whispered cautionary tale, not of heresy, but of the limitations of human understanding and the dangers of absolutism. In Oakhaven, the Relic of Resonant Sinuses continued its quiet work, a testament to the fact that peace could be found in the most mundane of forms, and that the simple, human need for rest was a sacred gift. Pilgrims still came, drawn by a need that transcended theological debate, and they left soothed, renewed, and perhaps a little bewildered by the unassuming power of a piece of bone. And the order of somnolent brethren flourished, their monks continuing to cultivate their resonant hums, their prayers a constant low thrum that mingled with the breath of the weary. They embraced the paradox, seeing Balthazar not as a problem to be solved, but as a profound teacher, a living example of how grace could seep into the world through the most ordinary, overlooked, and even initially terrifying channel. Their patron, the snoring saint, thus a reminder that holiness might not always roar with fire and thunder, but sometimes it simply hummed, deep and steady, a biological lullaby for a restless world. Balthazar paradox, therefore, was never truly solved. It simply wasked in me. It lingered, a complex, ironic, and strangely comforting presence in the collective human consciousness, a testament to the fact that the boundaries between the mundane and the miraculous, the profane and the sacred, the heretical and the saintly, were often far more fluid, far more absurd, and far more deeply human than any rigid dogma could ever account for. And sometimes, perhaps, the most profound forms of peace arrived not with a celestial choir, but with the quiet, earth-shaking, entirely unintentional snore of a humble, unsuspecting monk